All right, good morning, everybody. I'd like to bring this council process meeting to order. The first item on the agenda is to adopt the agenda. Do I have a mover? Councillor Arneson, seconded by Councillor Whitmarsh. All right, so council process committee agenda, where are we here? Okay, items for discussion. Oh, sorry.
We just need to call the vote.
Oh, yes, all in favor. It just seems so automatic. Okay, so we have the social sustainability strategy, and who would like to begin the discussion?
Good morning, Madam Chair.
There we are.
I'll start.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity. This item was referred by Council to a future CPC meeting just about over a year ago. So staff is here to provide Council Priorities Committee with, I guess, what might be referred to as a bit of a framing of the issue, because, as I said, a year has gone by, so Council may wish to have a bit of a refresher, if you will. So Mr. Ward and Ms. Robinson are here to do that at your discretion, or respond to questions simply. But I guess the revision that needs to be enshrined would be the amending of the second resolution to 2022 rather than 2021, obviously, because now we're a year into the process. So I'll leave that at your discretion. As I said, if you wish to have a bit of a framing of the issues, the journey that we've been on, or rather just leave it to Council and then respond to questions.
Okay. How does Council's, anybody have any questions? Yeah, I would like that.
Good. Control there. Wonderful. Great. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
So just further to Mr. Seppi's introduction there, thank you very much. This slide just gives a bit of a background on the timeline for the project. So on November 6th of 2017, Council approved terms of reference to guide the development of a social sustainability strategy to provide the groundwork for action in the social realm over the next decade. On March 5th of 2018, Council endorsed the appointment of the Social Sustainability Task Force members. It was in 2018 and 2019 that the bulk of the work to prepare the strategy took place. The strategy was informed by input from the task force, research, and extensive community engagement involving 45 different engagement activities, 1,500 interactions with community members, and over 1,100 hours of community input. On October 7th of 2019, Council received a report on the emerging directions for the strategy, and then authorized staff to undertake the next steps in drafting the strategy. And then, as Mr. Seppi had noted, on October 5th, 2020, Council received a presentation and report on the proposed strategy and referred it to the process committee. The social sustainability strategy envisions a future where everyone in the community can thrive, and it sets a course to get there. The strategy is intended to help sustain the positive qualities of our community, harness opportunities to tackle our social challenges, challenges which are not necessarily unique to the township, and then also thrive in the face of change. The strategy supports the implementation of the Township Sustainability Charter. The vision of the charter is to build a legacy for future generations that is socially, culturally, economically, and environmentally balanced. The strategy advances the social aspirations of the charter through clear social goals, priorities, and actions. The strategy is positioned to serve as an umbrella strategy for other township plans focused on social issues, such as the recently endorsed childcare and age and dementia-friendly action plans. The strategy also responds to policy in the township's OCP, specifically that consideration be given to the creation of a social sustainability plan to address needs of equity, health, and inclusion. Consistent with that OCP policy, the strategy addresses social equity in a number of ways. Social equity recognizes that different people and communities need different levels of support to have the opportunity to fully participate in community life. Treating people equitably is not the same as treating people equally. As shown on the slide, in the first image, everyone is being treated equally, but only one individual can fully participate by viewing the game. In the middle image, people are given the supports that they need to participate and view the game. And then in the third image, and this is really the dream, the cause of the barrier, that systemic barrier, has been removed so that everybody can enjoy the game without any additional supports. Equity was a guiding principle during the development of the strategy, and the strategy includes a number of recommended actions to further address social equity. The strategy states that social sustainability is a shared responsibility among all levels of government and requires involvement from numerous organizations, groups, and individuals. The strategy further states that it will take many different organizations working together within their respective mandates to address our social challenges. Because local governments have limited mandates and resources within the social realm, partnerships and collaboration are essential to achieving social goals. Recently, senior levels of government have demonstrated increased interest in funding social planning initiatives at the local level. Since the inception of the township's social planning function about 4 years ago, the township has secured over $2.7 million in grant funding to support local social planning initiatives. Turning now to the key components of the social sustainability strategy, the structure consists of a long-term vision statement, 3 goals, and 6 priorities with 31 actions. I will now turn it over to Ms. Robinson to go over these 6 priority areas.
Okay. So priority 1 for the strategy is Indigenous relations. The township's relationship with Indigenous communities has been growing in recent years. The Kwantlen First Nation and the township have partnered on a number of initiatives, including the development of the Salishan Place in Fort Langley. The township has also executed municipal servicing agreements with the Katzie, Matsqui, and Kwantlen First Nations. Actions in Priority 1 include supporting and implementing initiatives that raise community-wide awareness and understanding of local Indigenous histories, cultures, and issues. Another action is to provide cultural awareness education to all township staff and offer cultural safety training to Township Council and staff working with local First Nations and Indigenous organizations. Priority 2 is belonging. The goals for this priority are to strengthen community belonging, social connections, and civic engagement. Research shows that a strong sense of community belonging is associated with good physical and mental health and motivates individuals to make positive contributions in their community. The township already contributes to belonging through its recreation programs, community gathering spaces like parks and libraries, and community events, as well as the township's support for the Aldergrove Community Station House, Langley's first neighborhood house for community connections and resources. Recommended actions in this area include developing a volunteer strategy to enhance the township's volunteer programs and support volunteering in our community. And the township will also prepare and publish an inventory of low-cost space available for community use, and will work with local organizations, including the Fraser Valley Regional Library, School District 35, and local businesses to make more space available for community use. Priority 3 is housing and food. Housing and food are both basic human needs. Local data shows that over 200 people in Langley are currently homeless, and 7% of residents sometimes or often do not have enough to eat. Actions in this priority area include to research and consider policy and regulatory changes that would allow detached accessory dwelling units, for example, garden suites, in some areas, which would increase housing affordability and reduce sprawl. Another action is to research and explore opportunities to expand community food gardening, which could include integration with outdoor amenity areas and landscaping in multifamily developments and retrofits in existing parks. Priority 4 is lifelong learning. For this priority, learning is defined broadly, and it's understood that learning occurs at every stage of life, formally and informally. Lifelong learning provides a variety of important benefits, including improving incomes, fostering job stability, reducing loneliness, and nurturing relationships with communities of shared interest. Though the province and other organizations are primarily responsible for education, the township already participates in this space, for example, by providing school education workshops on climate change, recycling, and water conservation in elementary schools, as well as providing a variety of education programs through the Langley Centennial Museum. Actions in the lifelong learning priority see the township primarily in a facilitation and communication role. Actions include enhancing the promotion of the Fraser Valley Regional Library and other learning programs offered, such as those available in the Township of Langley's Leisure Guide. Another action is to support initiatives that build the capacity of public, private, and not-for-profit organizations to address community issues and innovate in more collaborative ways. One example is to work with local businesses to promote social purpose businesses, also called social enterprises, where for-profit and not-for-profit businesses work to actually serve a social purpose, such as employing harder-to-employ individuals or donating a percentage of profits to charity. Priority 5 is getting around. TransLink data shows that only 9% of weekday trips in the Township of Langley are made by walking, cycling, or transit, compared to 27% across Metro Vancouver. Walking, cycling, and transit are low or no-cost alternatives that help ensure that all residents, regardless of age, ability, or financial means, have good opportunities to get around. Most of the actions in this priority have already been mobilized through the Climate Action Strategy, including the development of a transportation and mobility strategy that will explore and enhance opportunities for active mobility, connectivity, safety, and accessibility. The identification of this action in the social sustainability strategy will ensure that a social lens is applied to this work, understanding that all township residents should have equitable access to transportation options. The final priority is health and safety. Local survey data shows that only 27% of residents have emergency supplies for 3 or more days. Recent climate change-related events, such as the heat dome in the summer and flooding in November, highlight the importance of emergency preparedness and ensuring our residents are safe and healthy. Actions in the health and safety priority are focused on supporting healthy living and community safety in areas within municipal authority, like parks and emergency management. Actions include promoting healthy living by enhancing township park spaces and trails through initiatives such as reviewing the per capita park area standards based on best practice research and recent development trends, as well as working with the Langley RCMP to foster community safety through enhanced education and prevention initiatives. By investing in education and prevention, the township can save money long-term through the avoidance of policing cost and dispatch of first responders in the fire department. The strategy also includes actions to ensure that social sustainability is integrated into township business practices and becomes business as usual. Specifically, the strategy recommends the development of a social equity policy that would serve as a lens to help ensure township policies, services, and infrastructure are inclusive of the full diversity of residents. A separate council motion related to an equity framework, which may actually begin the process to mobilize this action, was passed by council earlier this year and scheduled for discussion at a CPC meeting this January. So the table before you outlines the proposed funding to implement the strategy. $147,000 is anticipated to be funded through existing budgets and external grants. And phase 1 of the transportation mobility strategy mentioned earlier was approved as part of the 2021 budget, with phase 2 of the strategy pending in the 2022 budget process. What remains is the recommended annual operating funding to support the full implementation of the social sustainability strategy, which is estimated at $50,000 per year. So to bring this presentation to a close, the 2 recommendations in front of CPC today are that council endorse the social sustainability strategy and that council refer the request for $50,000 in operating funding to support the social sustainability strategy to 2022 budget deliberations. Thank you.
Thanks very much for the presentation. We have a couple of questions. Councillor Whitmarsh.
Great. Thank you very much for the reminder of what we discussed a year ago, and appreciate the information in the package as well. I had a couple of just brief questions. The $50,000 for this initiative on an annual basis over the next 5 years, is that $50,000 primarily for staffing, or maybe you could highlight what the $50,000 is specifically for?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. So that $50,000 is targeted primarily at Indigenous relations, belonging, learning, and the social sustainability integration action. So just a couple examples there. We're looking at cost to complete some major strategy work. So, and also, in the case of the social sustainability integration, there is some budget associated with the equity policy that Ms. Robinson had outlined as an example. With the Indigenous relations, there's some costs associated with developing a communications protocol just to assist the township in better communicating with our Indigenous communities. Also some costs for staff training. The full costs for the actions are outlined under Appendix D of the strategy, if council wanted to review those in detail.
Right, okay, so, yeah, that's helpful. So Appendix D, that's different than, I know in here we have page 6, it talks about $997,000 for the 5 years. Is that what you're referring to when you talk about the full cost, or are you referring to something different than that?
Oh, I've lost the slide here, pardon me. Are we able to put that last one back up? Yeah, might be helpful. So this table on the slide here, this totals the $997,000. As Ms. Robinson had noticed, $147,000 is anticipated to be funding through external grants and existing budgets, with $600,000 coming from DCC budgets. The 2022 is a request, with the first phase having been funded already. So it's the remaining, it's the $250,000, which is really unfunded.
Right, okay, and my last question was, the transportation and mobility strategy, can you just sort of just highlight just what that is and what is being done for the 600,000?
Absolutely. Well, I'll do my best. I'm not the transportation. Yeah, you bet. The idea is to update the township's transportation master plan, which was completed in the late 2000s. Obviously, our land use patterns and mobility has changed significantly even in that short amount of time. So the staff is looking at a complete update of that strategy, really to think about transportation, I think also in a much more of a holistic way. I would suggest that the transportation plan from the late 2000s is focused on our roads classification primarily. We have an opportunity now to focus on all different types of mobility moving forward. This action is also consistent with an action in the climate action strategy to update that transportation master plan, and hence that's why the budget for the first phase of the project was submitted and I suppose approved back in 2021. So it's consistent with a climate action strategy, but really to what Ms. Robinson had said, the opportunity to integrate it as a social sustainability strategy action as well would put a different lens on it. Obviously, transportation is an environmental issue, but it's also very much a social issue as much as it is an economic development issue.
Great, thank you very much.
Councillor Arneson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you very much for today's presentation and the refresher, because a year is quite a long time to obviously remember the details of these strategic policies that we want to consider in the township. So I just had a couple of questions to you. First of all, so thank you very much for the overview of the situation, because what resonates with me is the idea of being a resilient community, which I think covers a lot of bases, less social, economic, as well as environmental. So I did have a question, actually, and it was covered off by point number 6, the health and safety, because what I'm hoping, and if you could please clarify how this could be done. For example, when we look at social equity, we are currently working on the community forestry management plan, and that has like an equity score in there for trees, for example, because we know that certain environmental amenities are lacking in communities, or there's an overabundance in others, and trying to create a conformity or uniform expression of what that looks like, so parkland and access to nature. So is this something that you envision that would be able to, as we're going forward, knit these new kinds of initiatives or emerging trends into this ongoing plan? Is that what you see as a mechanism for going forward? And if so, then I assume that would have to be an extra budget consideration as those issues go forward. Thanks.
Yes, thank you for the question. And through the chair, I think one of the really keystone actions within the social sustainability strategy is this notion of developing a social equity policy, and really to use social equity as a lens in all of the work that we do. That's really the potential that this social equity policy has. So whether it's through policy development, such as the community forest management strategy, or through operations, or through program development, really applying a social equity lens is what the social sustainability strategy would take us a step further in being able to do.
Thank you. And the secondary question has to do with point number 3, housing and food. So I know our updated housing action plan has a lot of detailed information and a framework to go forward. I don't know why it suddenly occurred to me, but this might be a bit of offside question. I think that one of the things we need to consider when we're doing that is all options to provide affordability. And this may mean that our whole strategy for the way that we devise neighborhoods, it could be completely upended in some ways, just in terms of making smaller units, triplexes, different options. But I did happen to particularly settle on this idea of basements as an opportunity if the land value already has been integrated into the cost, and having a living space. You know, what kind of options could there be in the township of Langley for that? I mean, classically, people think about, oh, well, I wouldn't want to live in a basement suite, but there's a lot of opportunities, I think, for integrating that into creating further opportunities in some medium density in neighborhoods, you know. So I'm just wondering if that is something that might be considered under that guideline.
Yes, thank you for the question. I can say that the social sustainability strategy certainly identifies housing and food as an important priority in the township. An opportunity to mobilize that particular priority is through our housing action plan, the recently endorsed housing action plan. And an action in the housing action plan is to further consider opportunities for secondary suites, including looking at an exploratory option around secondary suites in ground-oriented multifamily development. So the BC Building Code has recently changed. There are opportunities now to do secondary suites in things like attached row houses and townhouses. We're not quite there yet, but it is identified as an exploratory action in the housing action plan.
Sorry, just to clarify, but if that's ground level, you mean on the ground floor, but that's not a basement?
Apologies, I was referring to ground-oriented multifamily development. So like something that has a front door on the ground, like a townhouse or a row house, but with the secondary suite presumably potentially in the basement, yes.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Great. Oh, thank you. Councillor Ferguson.
Yes, good morning, everyone. I hope everyone had a good weekend. I did want to say it was a very interesting report with a lot of information in it, and I don't want to go over every single point of it. It's very, very interesting, and it certainly puts forward a very good framework. But I guess my question is more like specific, and you may or may not be able to answer all, because number one, priority one, I don't know if they're all in any particular order, or whether 1.6 is any higher than 1, but there's 6 categories, I'd call it. It's the Indigenous relations. And I did want to say that you do refer in your report to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the calls to action, 5 of the 94. What I wanted to say is that as a member of the Metro Vancouver Indigenous Relations Committee and also Treaty Table, our calls, and you folks are staff as well, 5 years ago were 1,000 calls a year. Now it's up to 3,000+ calls a year. The staff and request for information has certainly magnified. Certainly, number one, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and number two, and I think you referred to it in your report, and I'm not sure if you have, I can't find it, but it was here, is the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. And I was just wondering if all those, I guess my first question is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action, and we call it under the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Have you analyzed or looked at that as far as potential staff time and also understanding the next steps of that, if I may, through the chair?
Yes, thank you for the question and through the chair. So there are three actions identified in the social sustainability strategy related to Indigenous relations. One is to, in partnership with our local Indigenous communities, explore opportunities to implement the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action. So it's exploratory. We haven't done the full analysis of what that might look like. And I'll go on to further note that one of the calls to action that's applicable to local governments under the TRC is to implement the UN declarations of the rights of Indigenous people. So it's all combined together as an exploratory action for us to further consider. The strategy does suggest that within about the 5-year time frame of this strategy, the township may wish to consider a staff resource, a half-time staff resource, to dedicate full-time and attention to Indigenous relations.
And so it's just supplemental, if I may. I think it's important to, we can't, like many of the things in your report, many of the things other folks in the room here have in their reports, is the fact, we're not alone in these type of things. You got the federal government, provincial government, you have the region. And I would think that a good strategy is to keep in touch with, I think the regional folks, and to do the best you can with provincial and of course federal. It's always a little bit more tough because they are working on keeping as much ahead or as parallel with the existing strategies because things are changing quickly. And I just wanted to, that's just more passing on information than anything else because the importance of it seems to be changing daily. Thank you very much. Excellent presentation.
Okay, Mayor Froese.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'd like to move the recommendation. Excuse me.
Okay, so all in favor? Okay, that's unanimous. All right, so on to the next item on the agenda is the public art policy review and update.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just
Yes.
as a note, Mr. Ward was so successful, perhaps we can bring him back for the budget presentation later on. I think it would be something we could attempt.
Thank you. You were very successful.
Effectively hearing that decline, we'll then go on to Mr. Tulamello, who I would just point out in the spirit of the Christmas season is Sicilian and is the only staff member here. Take that as you will. He's here to talk about the public art policy, which also was referred to this session. Again, ordinarily, I shouldn't say ordinarily, the direction from our McIntyre sessions were that these were really intended to be, I think, time for council to discuss issues in more detail. Mr. Tulamello will again refresh our memories in terms of going forward, but it's our intention at this point not to be adding too much new to the previous information, but rather just to jog the memory and to allow this matter to progress. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Through Madam Chair, I would like to do a little bit of a presentation update with respect to the policy update that I presented back in March 2021, so almost a year as well since you last took a look at that policy.
Excellent.
So as mentioned, what I did back in 2020, March 2021, I presented to Council amendments to the current public art policy, which would, which would firm up the processes and items such as site selection within the framework of the policy that had been adopted a few years back. So we've had public art in our community for many, many years already, and well before any policy had been developed with respect to this. We have it in parks, we have it out in the community, specifically in locations that are within the public realm. Policy now, as presented, does present a more encompassing look at where public art can be located and in what situations that public art will be presented to the community. So to remind everyone, the goal of public art is to enhance our cultural and physical environment through an activation of the public realm, including new, diverse, and accessible experiences, a visible presence for the arts across the Township of Langley that is of varying scale and form, improved access to the arts that will build new and more diverse audiences, and enables artists to explore, interpret, and reinterpret the township's heritage and unique neighborhoods in dynamic ways. So to begin with, there are public art exclusions. A lot of people go out into our parks and they see very creative presentations of playground structures and apparatuses, but that is not public art. That is creative design that is very artistic in presentation. Those elements are managed by the Parks and Parks Design and Development team. They do often talk about it with the community and make presentations in terms of how or what would be relevant to a particular spray park. And I think you've seen some elements of that presented in the past at public open houses. Also, the policy does not govern that art that begins to appear on private properties. That would have to be under a bylaw rather than a public art policy in order to determine whether council wishes to present parameters by which private owners could encourage or provide public art on their own properties. Now, how we acquire public art, sometimes it's done through purchasing. The museum has a budget of $5,000 per year to purchase art and artifacts relevant to our community. These are some examples of what has been purchased in the past. The work, Populars on the Fort Trail, will be an item that will be presented on a utility box wrap. The other piece, which is Hurdles by Sylvie Rousseau-Jensen, will be presented at McLeod Park with respect to the launch of the track and field championships. So we will install it at that location. It is an example of hurdles. It's a kinetic sculpture that as you rotate the wheel, the hurdler is jumping across the hurdles. Also, we do acquire public art by commission. For the pump house along Labonte, as we're going about wrapping the utility boxes, the Labonte pump house was presented to the Recreation Culture Parks Advisory Committee, and they had recommended that schools be involved in that wrap. And what you can see are what will be going on that building. One, the Harmony in Nature is from Langley Fine Arts School, and the Under the Sea is from Lynn Fripps. Also, we receive public art by donation. An example of that is the Rainbow Crosswalk in Fort Langley. Out of the Rainbow Crosswalk, they raised additional dollars and created this inclusivity benches project that was eventually installed in the Derrick Doubleday Arboretum. So private sponsorship can be something that would be considered. We haven't received funds directly for public art as yet, and that is a monetary donation that would be put towards public art that could be located in one of our communities. And there's no restrictions tied to the donation. However, a donor can discuss their preferences in regards to that. When a work is donated through a sponsorship, there has to be a 10% allocation towards maintaining and perhaps replacing that public art in the future, and that goes into a specific reserve. We also acquire, by way of community art competitions, banner art in the Walnut Grove community is not operated by the merchant or the BIA in that community. And often what happens is the roads department comes to our art staff through the museum and asks that a competition be held. And we've had great examples of student art that has gone up on banners in those communities. We also acquire art through a request for proposals process. A few years back, there was legacy funding left over from the summer games. We went through a publicly advertised process that requested images that would have a sports theme to it, as the public art was to be presented at McLeod Park. It resulted in over 10 submissions that were selected by a public art technical advisor team, and that included staff members and also members of the Recreation Culture Parks Advisory Committee. Artists were provided a $500 honorarium for the use of their distinct images. The final formatting and fabrication of the works was coordinated by the Parks Design and Development team. And these are the examples of some of the works that were submitted and laser cut into steel panels that are in the fence line between the stadium and the track. So they're quite nicely presented. There are actually gaps that could be fulfilled maybe in the future with respect to some other panels, so we could go out to a competition again. And we did it through the Fort Langley utility box art wraps. So we presented publicly advertised themes, Indigenous and nature images, and it resulted in several admissions from various artists. And the technical advisory team picked one or two from each of the artists. Artists were provided $350 for our licensing, use of their distinct images, and the final formatting will be coordinated with the engineering division. And I'm just going to show you examples of what will be going on the utility boxes in Fort Langley. With regard to site selection, in the community plans and the neighborhood plans, a lot of those areas had been put within that plan at locations that had a wider berth to locate public art on those properties. Council has approved 2 locations in the Willoughby community and artwork, and that process will be going on during 2022. So just to say a little about the Public Art Technical Advisory Committee, it's an ad hoc committee that is struck on a project-by-project basis. It can include external advisors for specific projects, and it's interdepartmental. So members from roads department might be involved, engineering might be involved, as well as parks design and development. So it's a moving team that is kind of put together on a case-by-case basis. And right now, so there's also the Public Art Reserve and funding of it. There's 10% on every project that is put into a reserve that will take care of the maintenance and repair of public art that is in the realm of the public, and it's put aside. It doesn't always necessarily replace an item. So if something is damaged beyond repair, we may not replace that item. We may launch another competition for that particular location. Greenway amenity policies also fund public art. In older communities, we're looking to use funds that were previously dedicated to the neighborhood improvement program. And of course, we are looking to establish an annual budget to purchase art from Township of Langley artists. As I mentioned previously, it is part of the museum's budget, has been there for probably about 30 years. And the township, through the museum, now owns over 800 works of art that are within the collection. So what I'm looking for right now is I'm seeking the endorsement of the amendments in the public art policy report that was presented on March 8th, 2021. And I can answer any questions anyone has.
Thank you. Councillor Arneson has a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mr. Tillamello. It's very appreciated that you're coming forward today and just do through an overview. I do have actually 4 questions. I hope that they are pertinent in the sense that I know what you're just suggesting is to look to the endorsement at this time. But based on what you just said, I did have some questions of clarification, I suppose, for certain things that have come up in my mind reading the report. So number 1, and I know that I don't think this is covered at all, but it would be a policy question, and I don't know if it's considered, but the policy for public art in roundabouts, this has become somewhat controversial, and so I don't know whether or not we seek to have at some future time, I'm not saying today, but a bylaw or consideration so that that can be considered within the broader context of public art as opposed to just getting a highway use permit and putting in installations, because, you know, I fear by precedent, for example, and it wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing, but in Gloucester, if Fryby wanted to put up a big sausage and, you know, they had a roundabout, and if this was not something that was covered by the policy, in fact, that could currently happen. So is that something you might anticipate?
I would think that it would have to come, because it is still township-owned property, it would have to come to township staff for consideration. And basically, we would define parameters that might be acceptable for a location in a roundabout. Very few roundabout locations have been identified in community plans as a location for public art. So it is something that is new. Often it comes to us through engineering or the roads department rather than directly to arts, culture, and community initiatives.
Okay, thank you. Myself, I'd prefer to have some kind of identified process for that. So, and secondly, you talked about murals, so the private versus the public space. So is it currently the case that anybody can just, you know, put up a mural? What's our current strategy around that? I think they're discouraged in Fort Langley, but I don't know about any other places, because I know it's a conservation area, so that would be the case there.
Yeah, do you want me to
Oh,
reply?
yes, please.
Sorry.
Thank you.
With respect to that, there is nothing under the public art policy that directs public or private enterprises from putting something on the side of their buildings or on their front lawns. That would have to come under a specialized bylaw. It could be through signage bylaw, but that doesn't include someone going out and putting a sculpture on their front lawn. Public art policy cannot decide that. It would be a bylaw that council would have to tailor for those concerns.
Okay, thank you. That's good. Number 3, this idea, and I know it's not covered off here, but the idea of dynamic lighting is an evolving area where public spaces are being lit up. Is this something that you think might be a consideration in the township of Langley, that you could add that to art installations, or would that be like a one-off consideration?
And again, it's by project basis. As an example, the piece that has been acquired for McLeod Park does have a light source behind it to create the illusion of a old-time motion picture of a hurdler. So yes, it could be part of the process of the call for proposals that would define that there would be a lighting source or that light be used in a particular project.
Okay, thank you. That's good to know. And based on what you're saying, I hadn't considered this before because I know we have a contingency fund for maintaining the public art. But I wondered whether or not any of these pieces would or could be considered a good idea to have them insured for vandalism or theft. Is that something anybody else would do? Would that be a best management practice if suddenly, somebody decided to take out or abscond with some of our public art? Thank you.
Would you like a comment with respect
Yes.
to that?
Oh, yes,
Yeah,
please. Sorry.
So all public art is identified under the township's policy, insurance policy, and however, often the deductible is greater than the cost of the public art. So, it doesn't often get used.
Okay, so we have Councillor Woodward. Are you done, Councillor Arson?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Tumelo. I recall some conversations, but maybe you can remind me where it's at. I read through the policy and I couldn't find any provision, maybe I missed it, for the public to apply for use of the reserve for some public art project that, say, some community group may have identified. They would probably be on township property, but maybe not. And then using the policy to potentially apply to have that funded through the public art reserve. Was there any mechanism for the public to potentially apply for the use of the reserve?
Yeah, there isn't defined within the policy. It would be a call for proposals. I mean, township would have to identify a specific location that they would like to place a sculpture or a work of art, and and when a request for proposals comes forward, artists may apply for that funding. But artists presented projects, there is not a grant process in place other than the Nothing Without Effort Fund, which is a maximum of $10,000. That does not provide sufficient funds for something like a sculpture. It would just not cover the cost.
Okay, so of course, the Nothing Without Effort grant is a nice way to fund some of these, to have it flow into the public art reserve, but the application requirements for that grant are so significant that it doesn't seem like a mechanism anybody's going to be able to use. I think we've seen that problem over the years, that no one typically applies for that grant because of the requirements. So back to the beginning, that doesn't really address the issue. So this came up back in 2019. I had a notice of motion about providing some sort of mechanism for the public to potentially identify a project, coordinate it, and then apply for use of the funds. And that's still sitting out there potentially as an unaddressed item. Really, this sounds to me like an entirely staff-driven policy and a staff-driven process. How would the public potentially apply for and coordinate a project on their own?
Yeah, you are correct. There is not a mechanism for that. And the reality with the Nothing Without Effort grant program is that it requires a organization or a nonprofit body to put something forward. When all of a sudden you open up the realm to individual artists to put forward something for township's consideration, that would probably open the floodgates of individuals coming forward and create a very complicated process of having to decide, well, whose project looks good, whose project do we want to support, and it can become very political in nature.
Yeah, no, I think we've seen how public art can become quite political very quickly. So again, I just want to be able to get back to a couple of these people. They're based in Fort Langley. They asked me a couple of years ago, if I have a corner of township property somewhere, say in Bedford Landing, that I want to say, oh, I'd like to see a public art project there. And it wasn't actually artist driven. It was actually more strata corporation driven. There's currently no path for them to use the public art policy or apply for a piece of public art. Doesn't even matter who the artist was. It wasn't about an artist trying to get paid. It was about just some strata corporation saying, hey, what about some public art? I see there's a public art reserve. Is there some way we could apply to use that? And I tried to address that in 2019, but just in the context of this update, there really is no contemplation. So the process would still be entirely driven by the staff and the management.
So-
just want to confirm that we're not really trying to address that.
So I think it is addressed through the sponsorship component of the public art policy, where if they are coming forward with funds for consideration, it would be a sponsorship item that would be presented to staff, and then staff would come to council and say, hey, this is the opportunity. Would you endorse the public art project that has been presented through private or other public groups?
Okay,
I think
so-
it could be addressed,
I
yes.
appreciate you reminding me of that, so I'll read that again. But of course, this group was not contemplating them paying for it. They were trying to find a way to make a proper application to potentially be considered for use.
Using
from the-
public funds.
Using the reserve for
Yes,
public art.
okay.
Not paying for it themselves.
Yes,
So I
okay.
just want to, I'll think about that some more and see whether that's something that can be addressed. Thanks.
Okay, Councillor Whitmarsh.
Thank you for the presentation. Just a couple of quick questions. Do you pronounce it P-A-TAC or PTAC, or how are you pronouncing that group?
Yeah, PTAG.
PTAC, okay. I'm just looking at the membership of PTAC and wondering if you have any idea of sort of how many members would be part of this PTAC group. The definition of it in here is fairly vague. It kind of, maybe that's intentional to be fairly vague on who are the members, or how many you would have as members, whether there would be externals or not. Maybe that's intentional. I'm just wondering approximately, sort of in your thinking, how many members would be part of this PTAC?
So, I mean, it really varies from project to project. If it is along a roadway, roads department and engineering would be invited to that. If it is in a park, Parks Design and Development would be invited to that process. As well, if it's a developer coming forward through a sponsorship, likely a developer would be part of that, or someone from that neighborhood would be invited with respect to sitting on that ad hoc committee for that particular project. Yeah, so it's very flexible and fluid.
Right, okay, so when a project comes forward to PTAC, is this PTAC group a decision-making body, or is it an advisory group that then advises either staff, or I'm not sure if it comes to council? I'm thinking of a major art project as opposed to something minor.
So more than likely, the request for expressions of interest that have been developed by that group would come to council for consideration.
And it would be like a recommendation that would come from PTAC saying, we endorse this, we like this project.
It would be a recommendation coming from the Arts, Culture, and Community Initiatives Division, along with a report.
Okay, but it will have gone through this PTAC group as part of that.
Totally.
Okay, that's helpful. The Public Art Reserve, it says that, we'll establish that public art reserve doesn't currently exist, or it does?
It does in various pockets. So the neighborhood plans have a component of public art and funds that are funding that piece. And there is also a commitment of dollars from the Nothing Without Effort Fund to establish a reserve that would consider projects in communities that are already grown out, such as Murrayville, such as Fort Langley, Alder Grove, and Walnut Grove.
Right, okay, so is there a sense that we're gonna bring these reserves together, or they'll still remain as?
They have to
Separate-
remain
as separate.
independent because of the requirements of the bylaws that situated up those neighborhoods, as well as other considerations. So they would be separate and separately monitored and administered.
Right, okay, and is there any thinking that with this policy, if we move forward with these changes, that there would be at some point an additional budget request to add money to the reserve in a greater amount than we currently might be?
Perhaps in the future, if there is a specific project that needs to be funded, staff might come to council with consideration of funding public art related to, say, the building of a new recreation center or a library or something of that nature, but it would be brought forward by staff under the budget process. Yeah.
Okay, so project by project as opposed to an undesignated annual contribution to the reserve fund of the public art.
Council could consider a contribution to that fund, and I believe one of the elements of the report that I presented was a 10,000 commitment for the acquisition of artworks that could go in council offices, recreation sites, and everything else. So there is a provision of a potential $10,000 fund, a $10,000 per year contribution, but it's not solidified. It would have to be brought forward to council through the budget process.
Okay, great, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Ferguson.
Hello, I promise I won't ask you a question on United Nations Declaration.
You promise not to?
Promise not to ask you that. Okay, it's been a lot of good questions. You know, it gives you an idea, whenever you talk about art, you're gonna get all sorts of different statements and questions, and it's been really good follow-up on questions. Now, this is the public art policy as compared to developmental art. And what I mean, always like to use examples. And I remember somebody that had come with a project in Willoughby with, I think all projects have to come with some art, but anyway, that'll be something you can comment on. And they wanted to put some decorative trees, similar to what you see in downtown Vancouver at the expensive hotels. And they found out to put the decorative tree would cost about 10 times more than just a normal kind of a ceramic tree, because of the, I guess the artist that did it cost a lot more money. Anyway, they were able to work something out with staff and things like that. Now, that was the first question regarding this is a public art versus developmental art. Could all projects come with an art piece, if I may, through a chair?
That would be dependent on communications with the development planning team, as whether that is a component of their development. And again, that would be treated as private, with very much encouragement to begin a talk with us, the township as well, as to what the relevance of, or what the imagery which would be appropriate for that particular development. And I'll give you an example. The building that the library in Willoughby is going to be established does have a public art component. Mm-hmm. However, they made their decisions on their own what that piece would be above the parkade entrance. Mm-hmm. Likely, even if it did come through us, we would have given the thumbs up, as it is a great piece that has been submitted by a community artist for that frieze area above the parkade entrance.
Okay, well, that's a good example. And is there, do we still have, and I'm thinking about donations, everybody's always looking for donations, especially this time of year, which is a need, different types of needs. Is there such a thing as we have a ability to give tax, what they call tax, or whatever it is? Do we still have the Park and Rec Foundation?
No, we do not have the Parks and Recs Foundation, but there is a donations policy that addresses donations for specific purposes.
So if I wanted to give the Township of, I used to be the foundation, we used to give money there, to the TOL, Township of Langley, what's that called? What's the fund called? Because you get a tax receipt or something for that, right? Do we have that still?
The Township of Langley, under the Charities Directorate, has the ability to issue tax deductible receipts for non-designated funds. So a offer would have to come with the condition that the Township of Langley would have the ability to do whatever it wants with the funds that are being received in order to issue a tax receipt. Some donations come without the necessity of a tax receipt, particularly through corporations who would put it under their advertising budgets as instead of a tax receipt situation.
So what's the name of that?
What's the name of that?
Who do I make the check out to?
You
Peter
make it out to
Tullamero?
Township of Langley.
Just Township family.
Yes.
So when I pay my tax, just put. Anyway, that was funny. Not quite as funny is the fact that I did remember a few minutes ago that Councillor Arneson talked about somebody putting a hot dog or wiener in the middle of a roundabout. Now I think that would be put Langley on the map for Stephen Colbert or Saturday Night Live. That would be beautiful. So anyway, that was a good point. It made my day. And also, my last one is I'm still not understanding, and I think it'll take some time, the private versus public, and you did some examples, and I don't know what the future looks like, or whether you ask them to take it down, but that's something else you guys will have to work out.
Right.
And that was not a question, that was a comment. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Councillor Whitmarsh?
Thank you. I just had one other question. When this came to council in March, we could have, discussed it in the normal fashion and made a decision at that meeting. In the report, it recommends that the staff were recommending that we actually bring it to CPC for further discussion. I'm just wondering why that was the case, and is there something that staff would want us to know as to why they wanted it to come to CPC as to just...
No, at the time that that was recommended, there was an awful lot of questions in terms of the roundabout and other projects that were going on. So staff felt that it would be better to allow council to take a look at this over a length of period of time and bring a more robust discussion through a CPC, which allows you to go as long as you want.
Right. Okay. Well, that's good. It was helpful for today. I just wanted to be sure that we covered off what staff was hoping to get from that as well. Thank you.
Okay, I don't see any further questions. Do I have a motion to endorse the public art policy? Okay. Councillor Whitmarsh and Councillor Ferguson seconds. All in favor? And motion carries. So now we move on to thank you, Mr. Tullamello.
Thank you.
Now we move on to,
I'm going to propose we take maybe a 10
Oh,
to 15
sure.
minute break, and then we'll get the next up. We're doing really well for time today, so we can
Okay.
take our next session and probably get our next session in and probably be done the 2-hour allotment and hopefully be finished. Sorry, Councillor Ferguson? Oh, we could try.
okay, so when do we come, when would you like us to come back? Quarter after? 10:20? Okay. Perfect.
Again, this is a continuation of our Macintosh sessions, if you will, in terms of the design and direction therefore provided. I'll let Sandra give a bit of an overview, and I'll comment on the slides as we go through.
Okay, welcome. I see that Councillor Woodward has his hand up. Do you have a question? Okay.
Yeah, I'm wondering if we could get the slides now-ish. Like, normally, I think in the last couple of budgets, we've had those on table while they were being presented. We don't have them currently.
Email them? We'll email them through as soon as we're done. So now we'll email them to you.
Thank you.
We just have an overview. To start with, our process has been a bit different this year. So in July and actually September, we had a couple of strategic sessions, which are now completed. Today, we're moving on to part 2, which is to confirm some direction and some process to set some envelopes. And then we will return in January and February with the more rigorous review and populate all the envelopes.
Thank you, Sandra. It's important to note that the Macintosh direction that we set has actually changed our process quite a bit. I would say overall, we used to be a bit more reactive, and now we're proactive, more so, as much as we can be. And where we're taking this from is at the Macintosh sessions, as we'll review in a moment, we actually set forth the direction or the principles that Council wanted to see completed in the budget. So we're not starting from an environmental scan as much as we are starting with a philosophy or direction that we then are challenged to put a framework around. So today's session is really to confirm the framework, and if we're successful in the framework we've chosen, if that represents what Council's direction, well, from the principles we've set forth, if that actually sets forth that, then we can come back as a group and set and populate the envelopes, which would be such things as the operating budget, the capital budget, the utilities budgets, and as well the carry forwards, although they're not really a budget, they're just more of a statement in terms of what we've previously committed to. So it's with that mindset, this is a bit different for all of us in that we're not looking to actually go through any detailed information today, but to recap what Macintosh has actually provided for us to ensure that that direction is still valid. And then if that is consistent with the Council's direction, we'll come back and revisit it with the specifics, and that way Council will have much more, time to look in the budget process, to provide direction as to the budget process, to be involved in setting the priorities, and to hopefully advance matters in such a way that it's meeting some of the concerns that were raised way back in the Macintosh session. There's a hand up. Was there a hand up?
I think Councillor Woodward, it looks like his hand is still up, but okay.
So this is an interesting slide that the City of Vancouver had compiled, and we've included in our information today. And it has the information from the 18 municipalities in Metro Vancouver. And we've pointed out where the Township of Langley stands. This is the average tax, including utility rates, compared to the other 18 municipalities. So we're in at $35.90. The average is $42.04. It's a representative household.
And if we could take a moment to study this, it's really quite illuminating, and we're going to provide some editorial comment in the next slide. But you can see that the township is done rather well, but it's also been rather challenged. We are near the bottom end of the municipalities in terms of tax rates or taxation. We are certainly one of the fastest growing municipalities. We're seeing that we're providing service levels that are commensurate with some of the other municipalities, the fastest growing municipalities. But our funding levels are being challenged in terms of the approach that we have, and in terms of the revenue available to us, whether it be from taxation, whether it be from grants, whether it be from casinos or lack thereof, or whether it be from any other source that's provided to us. You can see the municipalities that are below the township in this chart are actually much smaller. They have much more constrained and confined areas, and the closest to municipality of the township is probably Delta, But Delta is an interesting place in that it's not growing. Their population has actually been slowly reducing over the years. When we come to a growing municipality, the first one is actually going to likely be Coquitlam. Maple Ridge has had some growth, but you're seeing Coquitlam, and then you're seeing the average, and then you're seeing, of course, Surrey. Abbotsford's not on the chart, but if Abbotsford were on the chart, we think it would be more representative of the average. So we'll probably come back to this slide because it just takes a bit of time to digest, and this is something we'll ask council to take away and consider in terms of where we seek to be, and perhaps we seek to be at the bottom, perhaps we seek to be average, but each of those decision points has certain consequences that flow through our budget process in terms of available resources and the allocation of those resources to specific goals and objectives.
Oh, sorry. Mayor Froese has a question.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for that. It's an interesting chart. I know the city of Surrey, their tax, yeah, I can go back. They're talking about the tax rate it's already been advertised on the news media, where they're going this year. But they also have a fee put in for capital, like a levy in, I understand. And so is that captured in this table, or would you know if that's captured? Because some will have a levy. So basically, the city of Surrey, if that's including their levy, that's great. If it's not, then they're actually even higher than Township of Langley, because our levy, we don't have a levy system like that. So maybe we can, yeah, I don't know if it's in this data. It's not ours. I know it's City of Vancouver's.
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure. That was a question we were exploring.
Your Worship, I was able to look at that bit over the weekend. It's my understanding, and I couldn't conclusively prove it, that number there represents inclusive of the levy. So Surrey's at 43.78 because of their $200 or $300 levy that they implemented last year. That has had a significant impact on their overall rates, but of course it wasn't shown in the general tax rate increase. They've been at 3%, but they went at 3% and then added a levy on top of that, and then that's catapulted them up the ranking significantly. That's our understanding.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Whitmarsh.
Yes, thank you. I was just interested in looking at this, and I know you could spend a lot of time going through charts like this, but I'd be interested to know, and maybe we won't know today, maybe this is something that can come later, but how we sort of got here. Are we near the bottom because over the last 10 or 15 years we have had a smaller annual increase to our tax rate, and therefore now we're at the bottom? Or were we always at the bottom and we've just, we've kept pace by staying near the bottom, but we haven't kept up with maybe some of the other communities, and they just start ahead of us, and therefore they're just bigger than us. It's hard to know, and I know each community would be unique and different, but over the last, say, 15 years, have other communities increased their taxes at a faster rate than we have, and therefore we're now at the bottom. Were we at one point average? Maybe we're not, and now we're not. So I don't know. It's just helpful information maybe down the road, maybe not available today, but that's a question I would certainly have.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We can certainly delve into that in more detail, but I'll give my perception of the issue. The township, when it was a rural community, tended to be more towards the bottom. When we went through the situation of adding the full-time fire service, you may recall we had a number of years of 5% tax increases. That was effectively to pay for the fire service and was something that I think was demanded by the community. That took us more to an average or middle to average situation, but you may recall that I think it was one of the taxpayers federations criticized us for having higher tax rates than many, and we're suggesting it wasn't justified. The challenge, I think, became more clear, though, when we looked at the real dollars. So the first part of the answer to your question is it began in the low end as we were rural. As we transformed a bit more to the urban-rural interface, it began to rise up. But in recent years, I think the policy decisions have been trying to constrain spending. We've heard about that to ensure that we're growing perhaps only at the rate of inflation, and that really articulates the next level of the challenge. And I'm going to use an illustration here that is only an illustration. But when you start thinking of real dollars, if the township were to go with a 10% increase, that would generate $359. Now, if Surrey, in this example, were to go with a 10% increase, that would generate about $430. So that means for the same increase, Surrey is getting incrementally more dollars to that. So if we were to then say, well, maybe we will do 10% and Surrey does 5%, or go up to other communities up the chart, maybe New Westminster is the example, a 10% increase to us would be a 5% increase, say, to New Westminster. And that's because of our lower base starting point. It's when we start calculating real dollars that we begin to see the challenge, because, of course, the firefighters, QP, the RCMP, their costs are not determined by the township, they're determined by regional rates, and we're paying those regional rates to acquire those services, but when we do an increase for those, we're getting incrementally fewer dollars to cover it. Now, that doesn't mean that we should be raising taxes, it means we have to prioritize our spending in terms of what it is we wish to see. But as we've seen recently, we've begun to spend more and more time trying to quite properly meet some of the area urban residents' concerns about such things as trees or transportation and other matters. Well, that puts the pressure back on. So we have to then develop a tax rate that's kind of more built at home, that actually represents our priorities. And I think that's going to be the ongoing challenge, and why today we're looking at a framework that will help, but it's only a work in progress. It's a framework, though, that's special to our circumstances with the COVID environment. And we're also seeing, I think, today that some of the cost-cutting measures we took early on are helping us at this point, because it's providing with us with options and going forward. But more on that story as we go through the process.
Councillor Arneson.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you very much for this. I think it would be helpful at some future point if it's not included in the slide deck today. So one of the things I think would be a good overlay here in terms of other comparators, because, for example, the population of each jurisdiction, there's a huge range there of, what's between West Vancouver and Langley City, for example. And if I just look at Pitt Meadows, I can see that their rate, the actual amount that they pay, is pretty comparable, but there's, a huge difference between our population, for example, and theirs. And the other one would be the rate of their projected population growth. So I think in the last couple of years in particular, it's been like 3% in the township of Langley. And I would estimate that that likely wouldn't be the case for a number of the other communities here. So just to have, because anecdotally, I think there's, Mr. Bakken has expressed a way to look in more detail about what these numbers actually mean in terms of the amount of money that accrues to the township of Langley. But for me, I'd also like to be able to have a narrative, for example, around the fact that if we compared ourselves to some of the other more established communities, they likely have a huge range of the amenities and services that they already have a tax base to pay for, and they are maybe refurbishing them at a lower rate, whereas we are starting from scratch in many of these areas, because as we urbanize and invite people to our community, that's a cost of growth. And so we have a way to express there's a certain baseline. So our existing residents have to pay a certain amount. And then the expectation is for whatever else that we need, that has to be generated somehow. So I just think it would be helpful if we have some more indicators of how to compare ourselves to others, because that would be more reflective, I think, of our economic situation vis-a-vis our population and our growth. Thank you.
Yeah, I have a question, and I don't know if it's maybe going to be captured in maybe some of the next slides, but our business community, and what portion of the tax bill is paid by our businesses in the township of Langley, say, versus Surrey and some of these other, but yeah. Sorry, I don't know who would ask that.
It isn't captured in our other slides, but we can bring some of that information back. when we
Okay.
bring back the budget.
Okay. Councillor Ferguson?
Yeah, sorry, I was just looking at the theory of mathematical induction. Yeah, and actually does apply, because if the first term is true, then the second, and consequently, and I actually used this a number of years ago. I think that if you look at I love this map, because, or this flow chart. is, you know, if you look at these, and then we don't, you used to have a star beside it, and that'll be coming up of who's got the casinos and who doesn't, and who, you know, who's got the other ability to raise other revenues. And you'll see a little delta there. Well, guess what? The big casino's coming up. They're building it in Delta. So there are going to be revenues coming their way, and they're looking forward to it. So as the years go by, if we have a certain tax increase, whether 2, 3, or 5, that's going to be only hold our 2% of something, but 2% of one or a small number is going to be a small number. Where if you've got 2% of a very large number like West Vancouver, it's going to give you a greater return. So we all know that from simple arithmetic. Now, I get the next thing I would say is the fact that because our taxes, and over the years I've known we've always been able to keep them fairly low. People in Surrey, I don't know, through maybe the word politics keeps coming up, but through word of mouth or just sensationalism, they've always said their taxes are lower than Lang. They just say it. And I had a former mayor say it all the time. But that's never been the case. And I want to follow up, if I may, on Mayor Frose's comment. Will that, does that household or per door tax apply yearly, or was it a one-term deal, if I may, through the chair?
They're applying it every year, so it wasn't just a one-time levy. Each year they're putting that levy in place, and they're funding, whatever projects they wish, but we understand primarily infrastructure.
And, you know, I always kind of wonder if the resident in Surrey knows what that means, or if, I mean, because not everybody follows a budget process. Maybe you got an answer, Mark, maybe you don't. I wanted to ask it anyway.
I'm thinking that Surrey residents are probably simply looking at the bottom line and seeing where they compare. Surrey's already announced that they have one of the lowest tax rate increases among the published municipalities, I think at 2.99 or 3%. But they've been very careful to always segment that increase away from their levy. I find it interesting, just as an observation, that no one on the Surrey Council has actually said, well, the levy is part of that and that should be rolled into the overall increase. To my knowledge, that hasn't been the situation, and it's odd is all it is. So they've always been able to segment that, and perhaps that's because of the, I guess, authenticity of the infrastructure list. I'm just guessing as to why they do that. They must have specific projects or something that they're doing it for, and I guess the community has widely accepted it. It would be my guess.
I mean, tax time, it always comes up these interesting things. You know, Mayor Froese, you know, the mayor of West Vancouver, and so do I. I mean, I think there's something over 10,000 homes that are not occupied in West Vancouver. And I don't know what that means, but I don't know if you've heard that, but you'd have to do some digging. I don't expect you to do that, but when I sit down for lunch with the mayor of West Vancouver, she's always telling me that. And I always say, like, you know, my sense of humor, say, well, you guys like paying heavy taxes. And she said, no, we really don't. But they're caught because of years and years of high taxes. Okay, the next thing is my statement through the chair, and I know other members of council have a question. I think, by the way, just a comment, I don't think putting a per door fee or levy would be very successful or happy with our residents. That's one. But if that means if our taxes are lower, that would mean to say, would not be able to convince or put it out there anyway, developing community. That means our development cost charges should be higher, our fees should be higher, and the like. Does that make sense, if I may, through the chair?
Somewhat. The challenge is that each of those categories tends to compare amongst themselves. So let's take development cost charges. The real impact of development cost charges over the long term is going to be when we take the final product X, a certain percentage will go to development cost charges, a certain percentage to CACs. It's affecting the residual land value. The residual land value, though, takes years to actually impact in terms of the market change. And you generally are not going to be able to see an increase. So, for example, if we were to have a DCC rate that was well beyond, say, at the highest on the charts, it would be something that would perhaps help on the capital, but would certainly be widely criticized as being something that would be charging affordable home or impacting affordable home ownership, because it's going to be added in and segmented. So yes, it can be done, but it's not, it doesn't really help that much in terms of the nature of the debate. It also is something that's very limited in terms of what it can be used for, because remember, fundamentally, when we're talking about the general tax rates, we're talking about the ongoing operational costs. The contributions to capital are a little bit different, but the DCC program cannot embrace all aspects of the capital needs of the municipality. It's very limited in terms of what it can actually do. CACs give us a bit more of an option, but those are still in their infancy.
Okay, thank you. I know there's a lot of other questions coming up. It's certainly good debate.
So I think just some context, and we've discussed some of this already, actually, but around that graph. So out of the 18 municipalities, the township is the 15th lowest. I think we're pretty clear on that. And we are the lowest of the 4 fastest growing municipalities. And we do not have gaming revenue, which we've already talked about. And then there's been talk about the levy. So we could add a $500 levy, add it into there, and we'd still be below the average. And that would actually bring in about $22.7 million that we could use towards debt or infrastructure.
And just to be clear, we're not proposing a levy. We're proposing the funding, I guess, gap that exists and what that actually pragmatically means. Because the next, or in later slides, we'll actually talk about, well, if you didn't want to actually build X amount of dollars towards infrastructure, that could also be used to leverage debt, which would exponentially increase the amount one could have for capital projects if you increased your debt contribution. What it does show, though, is the conflict that's beginning to develop in terms of providing the urban level of services people are demanding or expecting vis-a-vis the available funding resources. We're really not funded in such a way as to be able to provide all of those urban needs. And I don't think that's going to change. I think, as wisely said by Councillor Ferguson, there would be a certain resistance to increasing taxes by $500 per parcel that I don't think Council would want to experience. So it's trying to find that blend in between that leaves us with something that's going to be defendable but moderates perhaps the demands for, for the residents. One question to ask ourselves is, well, when's the last time we actually explained to the residents that the fact that there isn't this service or isn't that piece of infrastructure is because the rates are among the lowest in the Metro Vancouver region, and how they feel about that. That's something that perhaps could be addressed, but you would know better than anyone in terms of people, when they want something, they tend to want or expect, and they compare to other municipalities. And the cost of that is something that becomes a bit of a secondary argument. So it does, again, emphasize the paradox we're beginning to see as that gap continues to grow, but the costs and the services continue to increase as well.
So to bring it back to our current discussions, this is the recap of where we've gotten to basically at this point. We had the resolution in July 12th to have a 3% or MPI unless other circumstances warrant for our tax increase. Some of the messages that we got out of those sessions was that we should maintain our service levels. And some of the things that we should look at is to ensure we have true cost recovery, that we may look at temporary reductions in our transfers to capital, which we'll call our CTCs, if we need them. We can look at slight user fee increases. We should use reserves and surpluses as they're available and relevant. We should pursue grant opportunities, and we will review our CTCs, our carry forwards, and our other capital projects that require funding for the year.
A very important slide for the staff, because this is what our notes or minutes show from those previous sessions and form the basis of the approach we're taking. We're not changing the course and suggesting something other than 3% is appropriate. We're saying that's been resolved. The test is, as you see before you, it was the lower of 3% or the MPI. The MPI is going to be coming in probably significantly higher than 3%, as we'll cover in subsequent slides. It looks like inflation is increasing, but it looks like the MPI is probably going to be closer to 6%. That's going to cause the need, again, for a rationalization or contraction in terms of our spending or in terms of how we spend, because we have to still fund those same services and products that have gone up significantly within this envelope that we have. And as we noted from the McIntosh session, it wasn't that we should reduce services. It wasn't that we should dramatically reduce capital. We could do some things on the fringes. It wasn't that we should exhaust reserves and surpluses, again, something on the fringes. It was also to look at borrowing, but smart borrowing. There was some discussion of whether we could do it on a business case basis. And that's a bit of a challenge because in most of our services, they are subsidized, if you will, because of the fact that they are going to be providing a community amenity that if it could operate on a business case basis and generate positive revenue, the private sector would undertake. So we've got to factor into that situation what is the appropriate amount of subsidy so that we can have such things as a road system or a proper recreation system or a proper community center. All those things become part of the equation where the question really isn't does the business case justify it? It's really how much of a subsidy do we wish to put into any given item, given where we're at the moment.
So part of our review, it's appropriate to look at where we think we're going to end up at the end of 2021. Obviously, it's a difficult year, and we've had COVID and a number of other things going on, but in relation to planning for the next 5 years, we believe that we will have $1.6 million surplus at the end of this year. Now, that is obviously an estimate at this point, subject to change as we move through our final weeks and numbers.
And an important number for the staff as well, because traditionally we would like to see that number higher, just because that means that we're operating within a margin of error of perhaps up to 1 or 2%, which on a budget the size of ours still generates significant revenue. And why that's important is traditionally that surplus has been used to fund capital projects going forward. Well, because of the COVID year we've experienced, and because of the good work by staff in terms of trying to constrain expenses but still maintain revenues, we did have a significant loss of revenue, but we were able to constrain that, and we hope, cross our fingers, that when the dust settles, we'll still have a very modest surplus. We're really looking at the surplus as being effectively a break even, and it could have just as easily been a negative 1.6 million to a positive 1.6 million. A negative number means we simply have to take from our reserves and balance out to zero. Effectively, in the scope of our budget, this number is effectively a zero because we're looking at a margin of error of under 1%, I think, in this situation. And whenever you're that close to the range, there is going to be a certain variability, and there's many unknowns in terms of what may still come in terms of expenses. If a good example would be if the RCMP costs had roosted this year as opposed to next year, in terms of the rate increases and whatnot, that would have dramatically impacted the number in terms of what we're looking at. Now, we've built in what we think the increases will be. We've continued to do so, but if it had all had come to roost, we would be looking at a bit of a different situation. So very kind of a veiled good news in that we're not in a negative, but we've cut it very close to the line, and that's due to a lot of good work by all of the staff trying to constrain expenses when revenues were much lower than we anticipated, than we projected before COVID. Yeah, there's a hand up.
Councillor Ferguson.
Yeah, I did want to say that on the RCMP, is it, another member council has brought it to our attention that is there money being put aside for the increases, if I may?
Yes, we have put aside the money that we believe we require. We put aside money every year. The final calculation isn't in it. They are suggesting that it'll be greater than what we had originally been told to put aside. So we have put aside additional money, but the final calculation has not been given to us at this point.
I guess that kind of begs the question. It kind of we're kind of like not alone. There's other jurisdictions that have, including smaller jurisdictions. I was just wondering. Your hands are kind of tied on that, and I just wondered, is there anything that we can provide or say or work with other RCMP communities, say, look, this has got to be fair. They just can't drop anything they want on us, if I may, through the chair.
I think what the federal government has done through the process with the province and through the process with municipalities, remembering that it flows that the province contracts for the policing and we pay our share, is they've given us fair warning of what it is. They've tried to outline what they think it's going to be on a proactive basis, and I think that they are still maintaining their current structure, which does provide for RCMP municipalities basically a grant of 10%, if you will, in exchange for the fact that they can redeploy the members as need be. I don't think, given the COVID constraints or given the flooding that we've seen in the province, that that's going to be something they're going to be looking at changing. I think that they're simply going to rely on the fact of the notice they provided in terms of what's been going on, so we can try to prepare for it. If there is a large number that comes forward beyond what we budgeted for, we can try to average that over the years by as we've done in previous circumstances. So that may provide us with some help, but it's going to be something that is going to be a challenge for sure.
I mean, just a kind of a corollary to that is the fact that, we look at a number of police officers, and I'm sure other jurisdictions do as well. And that's why I was wondering, you kind of have a think tank between RCMP members. Would that mean that we, say we wanted, I'll just say 10, we would only be able to afford 8 to 9 or something like that, if I may through the chair, because the contract and other expenses?
That's correct. It could affect us or any municipality in terms of their adding additional officers, because the incremental cost of each officer has gone up. If you have $100 to spend, and that would be something that would fund 3 positions, and now it only funds 2, they'll look to the municipalities to say, well, gee, you better increase your funding to that, because if that's a priority, you'll have to deal with that. And I think that's where we're likely headed.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Arneson?
Madam Chair. Thank you very much for this. And just to focus on this, not this slide in particular, but if we're discussing different options. And so one of the highest cost drivers, I believe, is the policing. And it's come up just recently in the past, but I feel that personally we haven't had enough of a discussion more broadly around the use of reserves. And so I know other communities have talked at a very detailed level about whether or not, because I know that this is something that has to be wrestled with, should we put away a certain percentage of monies for any reserve in the knowledge that it could or would likely impede capital projects that we need the same money for? So if those things are competing with each other, do we want to find a compromise where we're limiting the amount that we have? So we have a cap at each of the reserves, unless it's, a statutory reserve and we can't touch it anyways. But I just really feel that that's part of the missing dialogue that we could have in terms of, should we kind of piecemeal look at each and every reserve and say, should we be using that, as opposed to having a more holistic discussion about what is our position about reserves? Should we, as we evolve and are more challenged financially, should we consider that we need to address that whole policy via review? And just my second comment about the RCMP in particular, I just noticed recently in the papers, likely others have, Saanich, for example, has undertaken a review of their policing, and they now have individuals of a different order of training, and I would say they're delegating opportunities to others that would be more at the community policing level as a way to reduce the RCMP cost. And I'm not sure if we've had that active conversation here in the past, but it seems to me that that might be another thing, because these are issues that fundamentally are not going to be resolved on their own. So I think that maybe we need to have that conversation as well, not necessarily in 2022, but going forward, to say if there's more demand and more cost as a result, is there any other kind of model amenities that, or mitigation that we can use in order to reduce the cost that's associated with what we're required to do. So those are just kind of my comments, but really the reserves I think are critical, and I think we need to have more broader discussion about that. Thank you.
Madam Chair, just a comment on some of the comments, and very briefly. I think there's 3 distinct elements in terms of, there's the RCMP issue and using resources, or using, alternative service methods. But prior to that, there's really the discussion of the form of the reserves and the amount of the reserves. And one thing we'll be talking about is that our reserves are now at a level where we're kind of below the direction that previous councils have set. So we're looking at reserves as being a resource that should be used cautiously. I'll put it that way, because we're getting into an area where we don't have any operating line of credit per se. We do, but we don't use it. We operate it from the basis that we have cash, and we're getting to the point where it's becoming more challenging to manage those cash flows. Certainly can be done, but it's a bit more of a challenge. But that's a bit of a different discussion, the overall reserves, as opposed to the segmentation of those reserves. When we get to that, we'll likely see either this session or a future session. We have many reserves. Many municipalities are moving more towards just one reserve period, where the money sits there and they reserve. They don't have them segmented as we do, and that's their experience, that they want to have that flexibility in going forward in terms of using what they need, and they simply note what the demands are, but they don't actually have dedicated reserves to them. And for example, in our situation, the reserve, the RCMP reserve, has its two components. So it's to fund the RCMP, but it's also eventually to fund either an expansion of the existing detachment, or to buy out our partner in that detachment, so that we have more space available to us. I mean, that's the premise behind that reserve, and it remains something that's in effect. As to alternate service delivery models, they're a bit of a challenge. There used to be auxiliary RCMP members that certainly were less costly, that the force has decided is no longer appropriate given the difficult and challenging times we work within. In terms of safety and whatnot, because the RCMP themselves can become targets, so they've moved away from that model. And that also affects your community policing then, because there's some very base level services that the CPOs can provide, but generally they're relatively modest in the overall policing scheme, and the demand is for the hard policing services that are costly because of the per cost per member.
Councillor Woodward?
Yeah, thanks. I had a question. You mentioned that the money's been set aside over a number of years for the back pay. Maybe that's too simplistic, but back pay for RCMP. Where's that accounted for? I haven't seen that in any list or budget document that I've been sent. Maybe I missed it.
It just flows through our expenses for the year. So it's an accrued liability.
So there's no cash set aside to deal with that other than
Not in
the
the reserve bucket.
other than the RCMP reserve or other reserve funds. Okay, so it's an accrued liability. There's no cash reserve account we've been putting money into to potentially pay for that. When you say the amounts maybe been increasing from what we've been told in the past, can we get those numbers in terms of how much that's changed? Get that sent to us, please. And in terms of that, has there been any word back? I saw some emails go by about potentially FCM lobbying for the federal government to pick up a portion of this. Are we hearing anything back about if the federal government is going to be arbitrarily doing this, that they're going to be paying for some portion of it?
You're quite correct. The FCM is lobbying, but because of the, COVID environment and the costs associated with the impact on the economy, we're understanding that the federal government is reluctant to add in either to incur these costs, and they're looking at, instead of actually absorbing them, downloading them. So it was always a difficult move, but I don't think it's at all optimistic.
Okay, so at the moment, it still remains a possibility, however remote, that the damage may not be as bad as we're seeing. The federal government may, in fact, still pick up some of this, given they're the ones that are doing those negotiations.
Yeah, possible.
And it's much more than I think people were expecting. So hopefully we'll see that. Thank you.
Mayor Froese?
I'm just curious, how long have they been without a contractor? I mean, it's a transition to a new federal union for the RCMP, so they've basically been without an increase in pay for several years, and we've been anticipating. But yeah, here, if certainly the federal government wants to help out with that, because it's hard to anticipate. It's been a number of years, and they're way behind. Do you know how many years?
As I recall, it's 5 or 6. It's been a significant period of time.
Yeah.
It may have even before the start of not this term, but the last term, but it's been going on for a long time.
Yeah, and just another comment. Saanich Police has their own police department, their own police board, so they can set their own direction. They're not RCMP, so that may be one reason they can do that. And others have gone that route too, and it's more like a community police officer or special constable or something like that. So there's different. Usually they're municipal police forces, and the RCMP do have some sort of program like that where they bring in people who are retired, come back as. I don't know if that program's still going, but that's within the RCMP realm, not so much our realm. But municipal forces have more flexibility, I believe. So, just my comments. Thanks.
Okay, there's no more questions.
So just to provide some context around our approaching the budget and some of the issues that we will face in this budget cycle. So there's a lot of ongoing uncertainty with respect to COVID and full recovery of revenues, which is creating some uncertainty in the 2022 budget. And as we know, that's changing daily. As we've discussed, the RCMP contract settlement, it's still not finalized. We do have a lot of inflation and supply chain issues. Canadian inflation has been 4.7% for the last 2 months. BC inflation has been pegged at around 3.8%. And as has been alluded to before, we also know that that's probably not the same from a municipal price index perspective, which is usually higher based on the bundle of goods that we purchase. We believe that to be around 6%, which basically means we have to cut somewhere in our budgets the 3% to make up the difference. But our objective has been to maintain the core service levels as we move forward with this budget.
Just to clarify, while we use the term cut, it's really absorb. It's trying to figure out how we can be more efficient or try to absorb. And I guess the only warning we have is we've been doing it for sufficiently long now that as we compare to other municipalities, we are understaffed in certain areas. We're adequately staffed in other areas. We try to be more adequately staffed in the areas where they're having direct, connection with the residents. But in many of our back rooms, in terms of, so for example, some of the very basic things such as payroll, it's taken us years to add a single person, even though the municipality has grown exponentially since it started. Nothing really new to all of that. It just does show that as we continue to shoehorn things in, at some point the shoe will become too tight and it won't fit anymore. Right now we're still okay, but we're still seeing that tightening, and that tightening is going to be a challenge, certainly in future budgets.
So just an update, it's been since 2017 that the RCMP have been without a settlement. So we move into some of the actions that we took as we were compiling the budget. The draft budget provides for a scenario that's a 3% tax increase as directed. We have included a growth rate of 1.5%. The actual growth rate in 2021 was 1.38. We had budgeted a 1.7% increase last year, and we had to make some contraction on that. We did review development permits, licenses, fees, and increase the budgeted revenue to more closely reflect our expectation of those volumes. And we also assumed a 42% return of revenue loss due to COVID on our recreational facilities, which is a bit of a mix of 50% for some items and 30% for others, and we're recovering those over 3 years. We've also looked at the expenses that correlate with those. And we're also continuing to review true cost recoveries in areas.
I think the critical one for us here is the return of revenue. We, I think, felt really comfortable with that probably as little as 2 weeks ago, but now given recent events, we're not sure where that's going to take us. So I think it's a number we maintain. We assume that the facilities will continue to return to previous levels, perhaps not over 1 year, not 2 years, maybe 3 years, but it's going to be a slow uptake, and that's for two reasons. Number one, of course, it takes a while to rebuild your revenue just because of the COVID activities. But number two, both your clients and staff often decide that they're going to do other things. They may change their lifestyles. They may want to work less. They may want to undertake recreation activities in different forms. And it's something that's going to be a significant challenge going forward. We do have a number of facilities, though, that are very, I'll say, user-friendly and a bit unique. So that's one of the positives. But if I was to look at this list and say the one thing that does cause us some concern is the return of the lost revenue. Are we being too optimistic in that at the moment, or is there things that we can do? At the present time, I think we hold with that, but it's just going to be something we have to flag for future budgets.
Councillor Ferguson?
That kind of caught me off guard, these municipal price index. When we were discussing our budget, I think, wasn't, if I may through a chair, wasn't it at 3% when we were a year ago when we were discussing this?
At that time, we were predicting, I think, more like 4%, but there was the thought that with the onslaught of COVID that we may see that there was a need for some companies to bid lower to get the work. In fact, it's been quite the opposite. I'm not quite sure even now why, but we're seeing demand beyond what was anticipated, such that the companies are increasing their prices for the works and services they provide. So it's been an interesting experience.
And my next statement, my next question is your comments or the comments regarding the COVID and recovery. And now that things are changing again when the COVID or Omicron or whatever they call it, shutting down things like, I guess, sports and perhaps other things and travel and everything. Is there any, have you got any, I don't expect you to look in your crystal ball, but is that going to impact our proposed revenues that you guys talked about in item 4 here?
It's a good term. It is pretty much a crystal ball. I think the short answer is, as little as 2 weeks ago, we probably would have said not likely. Now I think we're saying probably it's likely. To what number, though, we don't know. And 2 weeks from now or 4 weeks from now, that could change because there's another set of directions provided. Because of that, I think we're suggesting we simply keep with that assumed return, which was based on projections prior to the start of Omicron. That we were seeing in the region. That's what that's really based upon, is trying to actually figure out what others are doing and where it looks like it's going to be returning. But it is a bit of a shot in the dark.
Yeah, that's an understatement. It's going to be, and the impact we just don't know. The people don't know. My last comment is, a year ago, I've got the 2020 budget in front of me, or 2021. It was done last year. And at that time, we had basically the COVID was going, but there's some recovery of some sort coming. And the municipal price index was a little bit lower. Inflation was a little bit lower. We weren't as concerned about the police budget as before. Now it's come up, and the cost of doing business is more. Would that be correct in your analysis, if I may, Sandra?
Yep, those are our pressures on the budget.
Thank you.
Councillor Whitmarsh?
Thank you. Just a quick question through the chair to staff on this point 4 again on the recreation facilities. Just so I understand what's being said here, is this the assumption that's stated here is that we will see a 40% return of 42% increase in revenue this year over last year from the facilities, or we will see a 42%, but that 42% will come over 3 years?
That is the return in the current year of the reduction that we made due to COVID.
Yes.
42% of it will return.
In
the
this next
remainder
year.
will return in the following 2 years.
Okay, with the idea that in 3 years we'll be back to 100%.
Yes.
Okay,
correct.
thank you.
So the actions that we took on expenditures was that we obviously collected all the information from the various departments, and then we reviewed all the discretionary increases, and we have made some preliminary adjustments. We did review the contribution to capital and the increases requested by staff. We did look at some small use of reserves where it was appropriate, and did some identification of projects as they relate to climate action.
I think that last point is the important one. We've been trying to incorporate some of the green initiatives as we've gone forward. We saw a presentation today about sustainability, but also some of the climate action components to it. And that very much is a work in progress, and that's where council's feedback, I think, will be important if we wanted to accelerate or decelerate some of those initiatives as we go through. The point is simply that we are recognizing them and we're trying to incorporate, but we're not simply doing it all at once. I think that would be a bit of a challenge for us, but we are committed to that path.
Councillor Arneson?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And just further to Mr. Backen's comments about the climate action, my assumption is that our very diligent staff are constantly looking out for all sources of revenue from other levels of government that will help us with our commitments, because the province, particularly in the federal government, are very much in the business of generating policies that create opportunities for local government to avail themselves as funding. So I don't know if this could be broken out as part of our budgeting expectations, if there's anything that's currently in the hopper for that, or just projections. I mean, for example, I know it doesn't fit neatly into the category, but the emergency we recently had with the flooding, I know that there will be monies for that. We may not wish to attribute them, for example, to climate action, but it's really directly linked to climate action. So I don't want to get into this situation where we're parsing out, well, it's climate action and we could delay this, because in fact, as we are repeatedly told, every time we spend $3 to $5 for climate infrastructure and resiliency, we're saving at least, 5 times that much in terms of future costs based on flooding and fires and things like that. So I just want to put that forward as something we need to consider to continue to have top of mind, is that, the attributes of spending for this in advance of further decline in the climate is going to put us in a much better financial situation in the future. But I know that that's a difficult calculus sometimes to put forward to a community when we have funding pressures, but to make sure that we are alive to the fact that that is actually the case. Thank you.
And just a quick comment, in future sessions, we'll be noting, I guess, where there's been a climate impact or climate action impact. I don't want to say that that's directly because of it, but there's a linkage that we've tried to incorporate into it, and that's something that you'll be able to see for all the reasons you've indicated. It's something that we're very cognizant of and trying to make that linkage, and it's something that's become a bit of a focal point in the budget process, at least to date.
So we'll push forward with some of the numbers that we have at this point in time. We have calculated the property tax, which includes a 3% increase, and also with the 1.5% growth is included in that property tax number at the top. We have other revenues from permits, fees, other types of revenue to get our total revenue of $217 million. We have expenses of $225 million, and in that we've actually made some adjustments, which includes, as you'll note on the bottom, a reduction in our contribution to capital of about $500K from previous years, which was about $8.8 million in the universal budget. So we end up with a deficit of about $7.6 million.
And as we'll see in subsequent slides, we do have a suggestion in terms of how we meet that. Our point there for pausing here, though, is just to show, despite solid revenue increases in some areas and trying to constrain expenses, when we look at our service levels and some of the directives we've taken from the McIntyre session, it still leads to a challenge because we're not in a situation, nor is council, where they want to see dramatic changes to our service levels or to our capital program. One obvious option would be simply to eliminate the capital program, but as we heard loud and clear, that would be a bit of a fool's game. Then you'd simply be actually having to pay for more infrastructure later. So we looked at this number and realized, well, we did have one asset that we had not fully utilized, and that'll show up in the subsequent slides.
So this is a listing of some of the things that we adjusted based on some of the information we had and some of the direction we had previously had. So we'll just run quickly through them. There was a request for increases to our contribution to capital in order to fund capital projects in the current year of $1.25 million. That's on top of our regular $8.8 million. We did reduce our planned contribution to the Capital Infrastructural Renewal and Replacement Reserve, which we've been trying to build up over the years. We had planned $500,000. We reduced that to $250,000. We reduced 50% of the OBIs, operating business impacts, from our capital in the current year, which was $625,000. We did remove the paving, additional paving, which was requested in this current year. We've been moving that up by about $500,000 each year. We did have a placeholder in the budget for 2 additional police officers for 1 quarter of the year, so we removed those. We did increase our recovery. We looked at some of our revenues and where they're sitting with actuals and realized that we actually had some room in our recovery for the police from the city. And we added some additional development revenue for permits, et cetera. And then we balanced that off and reduced the contribution to capital by $500,000.
I think the important thing to note is that in most cases, we haven't actually reduced any of the existing envelopes, and there is one exception. What we've done simply is reduce the rate of increase so that the amount of money that was previously available in most cases has remained available, but the requests for increases have been deferred to future, I guess, better economic times. The one where there has been a decrease, though, is in the contribution to capital. That envelope has been reduced somewhat because of the need to balance this. Now, while that's being done, we should point out that we have continued to proceed with the direction we have versus tree protection and canopy initiatives. But most importantly, this also includes the funding necessary, as the chief referenced, to deal with the staffing of the four-man crews as we for the fire department. As you may recall, we've had this situation with leaves and absences that quite often the trucks are facing 3 men on the trucks. And that becomes a bit of a natural evolution as we go forward, because as you get more seniority with some of the members, they're entitled to more leave, and that means then that you can't simply operate within your existing complement. You need to, to actually have, 4 men on a truck full time. You pretty much have to have a staffing level of 5 for those trucks, even though you're only ever going to have 4 on them. We managed to increase that, include that in this budget, so we've done some of the things that council has wished to see by trying to actually do some fine-tuning or some adjustments around the edges.
Councillor Ferguson.
Yeah, I get, is it 1% of taxes, about 1.45 million?
1.47.
Okay.
We round to 1.5 million.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, anyway, so the 2 additional, I'm looking at your list, it remove 2 additional police, that's just remove them for 3 months only? That's 1/4 of the year?
So the way we usually add officers is we add them in the October to December in the first year, and then we annualize them in the following year.
Mm-hmm.
So we've taken those out in this year. So there's no additional new officers, net new officers added this current year. We are still annualizing the officers we added from the previous year.
Okay, and what was coming from the previous year?
We added 4 officers last
We
year.
had 4.
So we had an increase of, this year, 575,000 to fund those officers,
Which
to
means
annualize
4
them.
officers, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, and even though you've had an additional revenue, an increased police city recovery, they could say no, or that's definitely going to happen?
That was just an adjustment in our budget, that we are already receiving that essentially.
Okay, they've written a check or something for that already?
Each year, yes.
Would that mean that, was that the same as saying that that's going to pay for an officer or something like that? Or maybe it's different the way accounting works?
Yeah, it's more about the funds that we need to recover from them for sharing of the offices, et cetera.
Very good, thank you.
So at this point, we want to look at some funding options for our deficit. So one of them is that we still have the Restart Grant available to us as a result of managing our expenses and our revenues and unexpected items. We have been able to retain that Restart Grant. The issue with this, obviously, and I think we've probably discussed this in the past, is that it's a 1-year solution and we'll have to come back with something in the following years, but that is an obvious solution.
As a commentary, it is something that's appropriate to use because it was for this very purpose. The challenge is next year, it does leave a bit of a structural, I guess, challenge. That being said, though, if there is a continued return, we're hopeful that number could continue to be much less as we go forward. And that would mean we'd have a similar challenge, but then there's going to be other options we may have. For example, we may see a bit of a recovery in the reserves. We also haven't dealt with the borrowing options that we'll talk about. in a few slides because it gives us a broader range, and it deals with the immediate impact that we're challenged by, which is the fact that there has been this unprecedented, I guess, economic impact from the pandemic.
We have a couple questions. Councillor Woodward?
Yeah, thanks, Madam Chair. I guess I'm a little confused, and I think maybe you can try to clear this up. I may have missed it from last year. I'm looking at a slide from the 2021 budget, which shows the non-discretionary and other and so on. It shows us using the Restart grant at a reduction in the tax increase of 5.47%. It's showing us actually having used that last year. But it's still, so I'm looking at it right here. It says we used it last year.
So it was projected to be used in 2021.
Okay.
And we have not had to use it in 2021 to offset expenses.
How have we not had to use it? So if we projected to reduce the tax increase by 5.4% based on the Restart grant one time, how did we end up not using it?
I guess the best way to look at it would be this year we projected a surplus of 1.6. We bring that in terms of the equilibrium. We didn't have to use that. So in a sense, the 7.6 plus the 1.6 would, I guess, show what we would then have left over. But we're taking that amount from last year and applying it this year.
Okay, I'll let others ask questions. I'm not following that. So if we are told or we thought we had used it and now it pops up again out of nowhere, not really following. So we're going to use it this year and will it show up again next year?
The only way it could show up again next year would be as if for some reason we could actually reduce expenses or raise revenues that would not need to have the projected deficit of the 7.6. So what we're really saying is that through the conservative spending and some of the increased revenue, we did not have to use that. So therefore, when we take that out of the equation, we put that in the reserve, we then are left with the 1.6. We're then bringing that back in this year. So we've effectively deferred that because of our constrained spending. Sandra, am I explaining that correctly?
Yeah, I mean, technically we recognized it in the previous year in our financial statements, but yes, it was sitting there available for us because we did not need to use that source, and it would have essentially, if we brought it in, increase our surplus.
Right, so we said, okay, because there, I think that was the magic word there. You basically actualized it, you used it, but so basically prior year surplus is 8.5 million. Is that a more simplistic way to look at it?
Yeah.
That would be one way to look at it. Okay, so can you go back to slide 10 for me, just while I'm here, asking specifically about this item? That's 11. Yeah, that's 11. Yeah. So just to just to follow along, so the staff have come back with a proposal that essentially the deficit matches prior year surplus minus 1.5 million. Would that be what you've done? Because there's no coincidence, obviously, that the two are the same, right? So,
right.
So prior year surplus is 8.5, and we're going to change this numbers based upon using basically this one-time prior year surplus. Is that essentially where this is going?
Yeah, I mean, it is a restart grant and has to be used for COVID restart. So again, it'll be applied essentially because we're still in restart.
Can you go back to where you were then, please? Because I guess you caught me a little bit off guard that we have millions of dollars that we sort of allocated and are still around. Yeah, that one there. So you have to use it for COVID restart. So, but you're essentially saying we're going to use it to make up the deficit basically from revenues? Is that how you're going to explain this?
Well, effectively, that would be correct because the revenues were much lower than anticipated. That is part of the COVID restart category that can be utilized. So, yes, that's one of the justifications for calling the COVID funds. You're also correct. I guess we could also have said it a different way, which is to use the COVID amount, try to increase the amount that was in surplus, and then simply bring the surplus in. We're trying to draw that direct linkage, though, between the deficit and the COVID, as opposed to suggesting that we're simply overspending.
Okay, and maybe somewhere in here, it'll show the decrease, specific decrease in revenues that's leading to this 7.6 million shortfall, because what is the extent of the structural problem that's being left for the next council at the next budget? It sounds to me like it's gonna be $5 million or so. Is that fair, where it's headed? So
4.5 to 5 was my
4.5%, you know, we're not gonna raise it, so that'll be left to the next council to come back in the first 2 months and have a 4 to 5% structural deficit.
Based on current projections, that's correct. That could be the challenge that they're faced with. That's right.
Thank you.
Councillor Whitmarsh.
Yes, thank you. My question pertains to slide 11. And I'm wondering, is this, this slide 11, the information that's here, is this an explanation of the changes or adjustments that were made so that we arrived at the $7.6 million deficit?
Yes, that is based on staff requests, and then these are the adjustments we made to those requests.
Okay, so if we were to not to do these, or if we were to accept these requests, then we would have much higher than 7.6. Okay, so slide 12 is the money that we have for COVID relief that's available to us. The numbers, you know, as Councillor Woodward suggested, are almost the same as our deficit. So good working on that. But so those slide 11 is inclusive of the $7.6 million deficit. Just wanted to be sure of that. That's helpful. Thank you.
And just to comment on that, that's correct. The requests were larger, and they've been tried to be modified to bring them in within that. And you're quite correct, that number is a balancing number. We've tried to re-engineer it backwards. It's not just a matter of having it happen that way. It was designed that way. And that's part of the challenge we go back to the earlier slides on, as was referenced well. You know, the challenge we're facing is that we have urban demands with rural revenues, I suppose, is one of the challenges. What we could look to do then is to try to protect or insulate the next council, which would be a bit of a deviation from the Macintosh principles. We could look at trying to actually drive that number lower. We could try to drive that down. Well, if we think it's going to be a $4.5 million deficit next year, we could try to drive that down this year. And how would you drive down the $4.5 million deficit? You could raise taxes to cover it, which is, as we've seen, a non-starter. The other thing we could do is we could cut capital, which we're trying not to do in accordance with those directions. What else we could do, of course, is we could try to reduce programs and expenditures, which is a bit of a challenge because, as we've seen, Council has been listening to the public and trying to provide some of the services they've requested, and we've seen some expansions in sustainability, climate action, tree protection, all those things, all very meritorious, that we're challenged with because ordinarily, if you're looking at trying to cut your expenses, the first thing you do is you don't add new programs. You actually simply pause and you defer and delay those programs because you don't want to actually incur those expenses. So it is setting up a bit of a challenge for 2022, but by that point, we still have some other options we can look at subsequent in terms of some shaving of the reserves a little bit, or the use of borrowing, which we think is going to be something that we're going to have to look at given some magnitude of some of the programs that are under Council's consideration, which we still haven't got to yet.
Councillor Ferguson.
I think that, Mr. Backen, when you mentioned the Macintosh resolution or edict, I was wondering if that has something to do with proactive versus reactive. And I know that, I don't know how you put a proactive versus reactive in a numbers and accounting, because I know that Dr. Macintosh has a lot of skills in, I guess, counseling, psychology, and analytical municipal, but I don't think he's got a background in accounting. So my thing is, how do you differentiate between what he has said versus what we're looking at today as far as numbers, accounting, audits, and the like?
So I think the best way, if we can go back, I think it's slide 11. So, nope, maybe slide 10. It's one where it had that balancing number. There we go. So in years gone by, we'd look at that number of 7.6 and say, well, that equates to whatever the tax rate increase has to be or the revenue enhancement would have to be. And we would then be left with trying to figure out what we deal with it. The Macintosh system actually was, and that would be a reactive response to it. Okay, well, we crunch the numbers and here's the gap, so we react by saying this is the amount of revenue we have to enhance or expenses we have to cut. Macintosh in that session said, well, instead set what your principles are, which we heard was 3%, 3% or the MPI, whichever is lower, and then try to work your way backwards from that. So that's what we've tried to do, again, with the other parameters that were provided, because Macintosh sort of could have said as well, reduce your capital or reduce your services or increase your revenue, increase your taxes, all those pieces. By getting those out of the way, we were proactively able to look at and saying, okay, well, we know what we can't do now, so what can we do? And this is where we're left with at this point in terms of, here are our options that we're discussing in terms of, okay, which of these does council feel comfortable with? But I'm glad it was pointed out, recognizing that there could be long-term implications, because revenue could be better, but revenue could be worse. We don't know that given the Omicron environment that we're looking at as well. So it's a bit of a crystal ball gazing. But even with all of that, we still have enough of a capital program, I guess, that if there was to be really a downturn, you could suspend your capital effectively for 1 year, do purely maintenance, and then allow the system to catch up. Many municipalities don't have that luxury. They're actually in a situation where they're not funding their capital at all, and as a consequence that they're looking at, well, casino revenue to fund their operations.
You know, I think you've kind of, you've done your best to answer that question. I don't think by any means that Dr. McIntosh took into consideration that there would be higher cost of living, higher costs of servicing, higher this, higher that, and also COVID going around. Those are all things, you know, to respect to him. He just, he's not immortal, can't predict the future. So, I mean, these numbers we're looking at today are a challenge. Now, I would like you you and the staff to flag this 7.6 as number 10, 11, and 12, so we have more time to look at the consequences of that, the provincial grant of whatever they call it, 7.6 million, whatever they call it, was given to us by the province, I imagine, and we'll flag it so we can have an idea what's COVID, what's not, how do we do it, and we've got a better understanding, because there's a lot of questions around slides 10, 11, and 12 today. So that's my suggestion, to flag it for the next time we are all full of council able to look at these things. And also we'll have it probably in advance so we can actually look at it more and ask more questions. Anyway, those are my comments. Thank you.
So one of the other options is that we've been looking at is borrowing. So we could fund our capital program, our capital envelope for the year, so we could reduce our actual contribution to capital coming out of our universal budget. But this will require the addition of debt servicing to be added into the budget to offset that. And again, it is really a one-year solution if we want to continue with our capital program. So currently, the MFA interest rate is estimated at 2.68 on a 20-year term. So for basically 1% budget increase, that's about $21 million. I mean, my cautionary note on the bottom is really that debt is a financing tool and it's not a funding tool. And ultimately, we have to figure out where those funds are going to come from to repay that debt over time. That does allow us some overtime.
Thank you, Sandra. It's really a fascinating situation in that we're looking at current borrowing interest rates as being effectively low as they ever have been. And when one can see the amount of debt service that can be handled, 1.4 million, which is effectively a 1% tax increase or a reduction in your capital program by that amount is a contribution. If you fund that towards debt, you're looking at generating about $22 million in terms of money that you could use for various capital items. We've looked at that long and hard and really have come back to determine that it really is, it's a bigger philosophical issue. It's not something that's going to be, I think, dealt with in this budget, but it means that there's been a traditional philosophy of the township not to borrow. In fact, as we did our research, we went back to, I think it was 1998 or so, and that's when there was this grand announcement of a debt-free policy where there was a debt-free reserve that was created that was actually intended to eliminate all general debt that we actually had experienced by creation of a reserve that money would flow into, with the idea that it would be then to be able to pay that debt out at its renewal times and renewal periods. And that effectively became the overall direction to not be using debt. 1997 or 8 was a much different time than now, though the rates were much higher, the concerns of the community much different than they are now in terms of what spending was being utilized for. So it is something that's a viable alternative to us if we can find that right mix, that right blend to it, because it provides us with the option to undertake capital programs at a cost of capital lower than we've seen previously.
So this was just to provide a snapshot of where we're currently sitting with our debt. We do have MFA debt of 177 million, soon to go up to 180 million. That is funded from various places, some from pretty much evenly distributed almost, from DCC, from utilities, and from the general tax fund. So our debt servicing is 11.2 currently.
I know there's a hand up, but perhaps we should do the next slide as well, just to give the picture, because that's one small element of it. But when we look at what our potential is, again, not recommending it, but when we look at what our potential is, when we did the research, it showed an interesting situation. Go to the next slide, I think, the next slide. Sandra, I'll let you explain this, then I'll explain it, and then we'll get some comments.
Okay, so basically, our allowable municipal debt is based on how much our debt servicing can support, which is based on previous year's revenues and a percentage of that. So, and then you reduce what your current debt servicing is. So then that means it can fluctuate with interest rates. So currently our interest rates are quite low. So we could take on approximately another 48 million in debt servicing, which would allow us about $715,000 in overall debt. That does equate to debt servicing of a 32% increase in property taxes. But we provided a list of some of the items that we may need to have to look at over time to use that debt for.
Just as a comment, this is something that takes some time to digest, and it is really theoretical. It's not really a practical number. It's really theoretical, because it says, again, that we could have interest payments, if you will, or principal interest payments of $48 million a year, and then we could actually borrow up to $715 million. And by way of note, when we simply did a quick tally of our ongoing needs, which have not been prioritized yet, which council needs to digest and take some time on, you could actually reach up to $420 million in terms of expenditures. Certainly not something we're suggesting, but it's a good illustration of it. Now, the real challenge, though, is when you start to borrow, you have to then, of course, repay. And if we were to try to borrow 48 million, that just happens to, if we were really trying to borrow up to and have $48 million in payments, that would equate to having to raise revenue by 32%. Of course, that's not realistic in terms of what that would actually generate. Right now, our contribution to capital, we'll say, is 9 million. So, that in and of itself would probably generate, as a multiplier, I'm going to say maybe about $200 million if we were to go down that path. Again, not suggesting it, but it provides you a different window in terms of seeing what the leverage can do and what the impact is in terms of some of the overall, opportunities that exist with debt, but also some of the philosophical issues that exist in terms of even considering the use of debt.
Councillor Woodward?
Yeah, thanks. Can you go one slide back, please? Yeah, there the debt. So the debt's aggregated for us in millions, and I believe we've been, and maybe it's coming later, but I believe we've been given a breakdown of the millions by project. In addition to that, maybe you can get all of council, another budget request here, get all of council the start date of the specific debt line items that are in the 57, 39, and 84, their start date and maturity dates and balances. So we can start to see when some of this debt is going to be basically matured and gone, and start to see, because it's fine to look at it like, oh, $180 million, pretty scary, but if some of that starts to go away in 10 years, I think that would be important to see when that number is going to start to drop. And I'd also like to see when the opportunity potentially arises to consolidate or retire some of that debt. So if we have maturity dates coming up, I'd like to get those as well on each specific loan. Thanks.
We bring those forward usually as part of our universal budget, so that will be part of it.
Yeah, I think that would be great to see that as a separate slide, similar to what you're doing for us for the reserve slide. Each one is broken out. It's got some dates and information attached to it, and then I'll take it from there and look at, start to see and wrap my head around some of that debt's going to start to disappear. Thanks.
So just as an update for if we're thinking about using debt, just that the timeline to get debt really is quite long, so we have quite a lead
Sandra,
time.
Just, the mayor had his hand up. I don't know if
sorry.
he put it down deliberately.
I thought you took it down.
Well, Mr. Backen was very good at explaining that last slide, so it helped me a lot. And I know other involved with metros, so we see how they do things. They're very capital heavy. That's what they do, is they tend to build things, and they have a pretty good policy on debt. When you build a major piece of infrastructure that's going to last 100 years, you look at the future taxpayers or users paying for it with some money coming out of reserves. So do we look at that at all when we're analyzing projects? We look at our debt sometimes, or borrowing for the flashy things like recreation centers and museums and that sort of thing, but there's always the unflashy things like pipes and roads and that we need to continue to build. So is there a policy framework that staff look at and follow, or some guidelines or best practices? Maybe you can elaborate on that, just so get a handle on how the debt is being used as a tool, because debt is a tool moving forward and building this much needed infrastructure, which will last a long time. So
I guess we start with the premise that council's discretion is unfettered and they can actually steer it in which direction they proceed, but try to help council, I guess, in terms of making wise choices, is we try to itemize in our capital list and rank them in terms of the various priorities that we have. And the priorities are primarily based on, I think, obviously health and safety and the duration of the asset and matching grants and all those pieces to it. So through that process, we try to come up with a prioritization based, if you will, on a formula that we think reflects council's directions. But as I started by saying, is council's discretion is always unfettered. And in recent years, we've heard more and more concerns about the fact that some of these rankings, if you will, probably don't adequately grasp or capture some of the council directions in terms of some of the needs that the community is actually facing. That they may be, if you will, too heavily emphasized one way or the other, and the council needs enhanced discretion in some of those, even to the point where there was even a suggestion that perhaps there should be a staff pool and a council pool, which is challenging to us in terms of capital, because of course it's all a council pool. It's just trying to determine the philosophies and the direction that we're taking in regards to it. So the short answer to your question is yes, we try to provide that guidance, I guess, through the ranking system, but the ranking system is only as good as the inputs that we've been using, and some of those inputs are traditional and have been around for quite some time. Your Worship, you also mentioned, though, the Metro, I guess, budget system that's in place. Is there any wisdom that we may be able to derive from that system? Because I think they have a significantly larger budget, but they're able to actually, I think, navigate those waters in a much tighter timeline. Is there anything that you've observed from that would be helpful for us?
yeah, I have to go back to the finance people over there to get more detail, but they do have a process where it's like a cap on borrowing for projects, and they use that, and it's a certain percentage of debt that the organization wants to carry. So there is that kind of a debt cap, but similar to what we have here. One interesting thing from you talk about the priorities, TransLink uses the term state of good repair. It's really big on them, is maintaining their assets in a state of good repair. So knowing what the assets are, number one, ranking the assets and saying, it's better to keep them in a state of good repair than have them fail and repair them later. But they're dealing with moving stock and trains and rails and buses and but all the moving parts that they have. But it's just an interesting term in that they focus that, and the board understands that if we don't keep putting money in to replace and improve and repair, the costs are greater later. So there's that philosophy there too. But I'm sure, I know our staff are looking at that too.
We capture some of that through what we classify as a discretionary and non-discretionary. Non-discretionary is obviously the health and safety matters, where if that bridge isn't fixed or repaired, it could fall down, those sorts of issues. They catapult quickly to the top. I don't think we've got that phrase, though. That's something we can take away and think about, the state of good repair phrase, but we capture the concepts, but probably not as eloquently.
They maybe have a copyright on it, I don't know. Thanks.
So one of our other options is, and we've discussed it a little bit here, is our reserve funds.
Sandra, you were too quick. We should probably go back because
Oh, sorry.
through the flow chart. I think it's important to recognize or touch upon the timing that actually takes.
yeah.
You did, but I think we should reinforce that. So you go ahead.
So generally, it takes probably 6 to 9 months from beginning to end to get financing in place. Right now, with the government is, I will say, preoccupied with flooding and other issues, and so it's taking even longer. But it is quite a lengthy process, and currently, we would typically fund that with working capital that we have on hand in the interim, but you can't do that for much larger purchases. So I think it's just...
And it is remarkable how long the process takes, and also the, I guess, decision points along that process. Other levels of government don't have that, I guess, challenging time frame or the challenging decision points, because as you'll see in this flow chart, quite often it's necessary to actually authorize the loan, go forward, then notify the public, go through that process. Maybe you have to do some interim borrowing through another bylaw or loan process till ultimately you'll get the final approval and authorization so you can actually have the complete loan process complete. There could be 3 or 4 decision points along that process that require affirmative council resolutions that, of course, are susceptible to changing environment or public concerns about the expenditures that make planning a very big challenge in some of those situations, because you may be convinced that this project today is something that we should embark upon, but after having heard from the public, there may be a reconsideration of that then can throw your whole budget cycle into a bit of a skew, because, of course, this doesn't happen in 30 or 60 days. It's happening in, I guess, 3/4 of a year, I guess would be the time frame. And that 3/4 of a year is a very long time in the world of municipal government.
Councillor Ferguson has a question.
Okay, now, we're a child, if I may through a chair, we're a child of the province, but the borrowing is our individual. We're not getting any money at all from the province, correct? Okay, now, I guess as far as speeding up the process, that we have 2 government party representatives in our riding. Can we use them or some the best we can, or anybody we can, to speed up the process? I mean, I'm just suggesting right now, but I'm sure everybody has this challenge, but I wanted, it's important to Langley to get our funding through, our resources through, if I may through a chair.
Yes, they can help advocate, but they cannot provide any direction, and I'll come back to that. I'm glad you referenced it, Councillor Ferguson, because in the process, I think there's also a potential complication that this whole process may also have to be endorsed by the Metro Board through the process itself. And why I'm saying that is quite often other municipalities are not doing loans on a case-by-case basis, but they're creating a pool of capital in the tens or hundreds of millions of dollars in anticipating of their borrowings going forward, so they then effectively have a fund or funds that they can use for their projects. That's important because it means then you're not going back to the market repeatedly, and if there was to be borrowing at the rates we're seeing, we're certainly suggesting, perhaps not this year, but in 2022, that we embark upon that, because it's going to be probably the end of the lowest rates we're about to see for some time. Returning to your question, then, the role of the MLAs, though, can be to advocate. There's this distinction, I guess, between the independence of the financing process and the authorities and their attempt to try to move it along. As was referenced, then the minister has to sign off on that at some point. They can try to itemize to the minister the importance of it, but the minister is still bound by the process themselves, and that means that it's going to take some time to get through the various approvals and stages, because they've got a vetting process to make sure that all the conditions that we've seen that Sandra's mentioned in terms of, well, overall debt rate, cash, the ability to repay that debt, the percentage of your overall revenue, et cetera. They've got to go through that and vet that from our official financial statements as well. So that does take some time, and with the other priorities they're facing, it certainly is taking longer.
Okay, just a kind of a understanding question. Is it, I'm looking at your flow chart, I'm just wondering where Metro is on here, and that, or that's specific, or just general items, or everything? That's the first kind of suggestion. And the second thing is, we don't do the larger amounts, you say that what they call the total amounts, or the wrong term would be slush fund, but a fund. And I'm not sure what communities you're talking about other than the big ones: Vancouver, Burnaby, Richmond, Surrey. So that's, did you get that question, if I may?
Yeah. There's two parts to your question. There really is, where does Metro fit in, and the what we'll call the pool borrowing as opposed to the project borrowing. I believe that the approvals are going to be dependent upon, there are going to be conditions of a couple of either the inspector's approval or the ministerial approval that has to go forward. There are a condition of that before it advances, but I'll let Sandra comment in terms of where they fit best.
Goes to Metro first.
So it'll be the inspector approval then.
Oh, inspector's approval. Okay, that's the first one.
So it's a precondition. The next topic then comes down to the pooling versus the project. I guess the best example that we see locally was probably within the last 3 to 5 years. Surrey did that very matter.
Yes,
I think they went for about $250 million. And they had a list of projects ranging from their city center to recreation centers to, I think, even the Bear Creek Sports Stadium, maybe one of the last pieces of that. So they bundled it all up, went to their borrowed it, and have started a significant capital program. Whereas, that's Surrey. On the other side, many years ago, Abbotsford did the same thing for their Abbotsford Entertainment Center and a number of other projects. They did that as well. That means you're committing to a significant, capital program and contribution, which can be a bit challenging. We have seen greater success in the project by project. People can actually understand or entertain that, where they know what they're getting. You're more transparent. But of course, that's very inefficient, because that inefficiency means you're going for a project that could be 2 million, 5 million, 10 million. And that's our challenge, is finding that balance that's going to work so it can be defended by council in terms of what the initiatives are, without making it if you will, a referendum not on the projects, but on the decision-making process itself.
And the last thing is kind of thinking out loud, because I think this is going to be an ongoing anyway, is the fact that we are, they're not making any more land. We are in a situation where we're always looking for land for parks, for schools, for utilities, for roads, and the list goes on. Would it be a strategy in future to look at pooling, knowing the fact that once a property comes up, there's going to be a number of people looking to get at it? If that's just a kind of a comment.
No, I think you're very wise in that comment, because what we're seeing is that if we were to look at real property and say, well, we wanted to buy this 10-acre parcel, if we sign the contract today, best case, we can look at probably getting you the money in 9 months. That's incredibly challenging when you're dealing with a marketplace that's saying, I can get you the money in 30 or 60 days. And that's one of the benefits of doing a pooling, where you've got the project listed. On the other hand, I think it would be foolish for staff to be suggesting that, in the 2022 budget, we should go forward with a $200 million borrowing bylaw, given what's going to be happening in October. That just wouldn't be fair to anybody. So that may not be something that's maybe a matter of timing.
Thank you.
Councillor Arneson?
Oh, still writing notes to self. I had a question, and I hope it's not just a philosophical question. I hope it's actually a practical question. So maybe through Madam Chair to Mr. Backen, perhaps. So I'm thinking about this vetting process that I'm not very familiar with. And I know there's standardization in terms of the economics of working on infrastructure. I'm sort of aware of the World Bank, for example. And one of the things that they do is they look at the country who's looking to borrow, and they say to themselves, so I'm getting beyond, obviously, the metro model. So I'm just looking at, they say, okay, now, we're going to lend you this money. These are our expectations. And by the way, when are you going to pay it back? And so this is very simplistic. But what I'm looking at is the degree to which we would be vetted in some way as to having what I consider to be, and it's not insurmountable, but we have structural problems. If we already have identified what the deficiencies, where they're coming from, because as we're developing it as an urban community, but we have lots of land in the LR, and for other reasons, we don't necessarily have the projected tax base. What I'm struggling with is this idea that as we go forward, that we would be viewed in a positive manner vis-a-vis other communities, such as the city of Surrey, for example, that has a completely different business model than we could, at this stage, end up with, in my opinion. So I'm not really too certain about this decision-making process, and to go through this articulation of what we need, when we need it, and how we're going to pay for it, lacking a fundamental plan of understanding how our situation is going to change in the interim in order to economically be sustainable under the circumstances. Because in my simplistic view, at the same time we're developing all sorts of infrastructure that then in 10 or 20 years we have to now maintain, which is yet another cost. So if we already have a deficit based on this kind of upside down kind of business plan, in a way, if we were a business, this would not happen to us. We would have a product, we'd have widgets, we'd sell them, we could accommodate, what's going on, what the market will bear. This, to me, is not what we're talking about. So if we're talking about this, then I would like to know, for example, the degree to which we have a very sound plan going forward, because the other vagary that I struggle with is that we cannot have a plan that fetters future councils. And any plan that we create today or next year, whenever that is going to be subject to the fact that there could be other constraints that another council in our shoes will not want to have this indebtedness. So, these are not value propositions to me, they're practicalities that we need to consider. So I just want to put that forward as being something that creates a sense of, if we're going to consider borrowing, I'd like to consider it as a multi-pronged approach, where we're doing what we're doing to contain costs, but at the same time doing the borrowing and not necessarily making a ballooned borrowing proposition with, an itemized list of things to do, because that's where I see us kind of potentially getting out into the deep end in terms of trying to project for 10, 20, 30 years what the situation is going to be and how we're going to manage that. And if we had a structure where I knew that everybody was committed to this for the next amount of time, and it was more predictable that way, but, subject to political vagaries, I find this to be a bit, of a challenge.
I guess I'll start with, that's a very broad range of topics, and a broad range of comments.
Yes.
But I'll try to summarize it in reverse order this way. Beginning with the fettering of council. Any council can enter into a contract that other councils must abide by, but no council can say that you can simply ignore that obligation. You have to actually then undo those contractual relations. So any council can cancel a contract, but they must incur the expenses that go along with that. So in that way, council's discretion is not fettered by the fact that there was a contractual obligation. But no one gets a get out of jail free card. They have to actually go and play by the rules of contract law. As we work it backwards then through the commentaries then, the way the system is designed to work is that the region and the province provides, I guess, the major infrastructure that you can then connect to. And that major infrastructure can be thought of as transportation routes, regional sewage plants, regional water, all of those things. The municipalities then are left with the ability, and sometimes that cost is not all that realistic, to connect to those regional initiatives as part of their own growth patterns in terms of what they've done through their own OCPs and neighborhood plans and all of those pieces. And generally, growth is thought of to be a positive, I suppose, in the region, because of, not just because of the implications of the taxation, but also because of economic growth and drivers, that the old saying comes into effect that we're not a business. We can run like a business, but we're not a business because we've got many aspirations that go beyond what any business would have. And when you reference the fact that if we were a business, we'd be very easy to plan because we need to know what our assembly line is, our land costs are, our building costs are for a widget. It's something that we can do, but we must recognize that we must supply widgets, if you will, to those that don't want them, to those that can't afford them, and those that, if they can't afford them, still want to have the variability of getting the widgets from some other sources. So it becomes a very complex matter in terms of what is, good public policy in terms of whether we should be growing or not growing, and what the benefits of that are, and can they be measured simply on the basis of property tax revenue. So with that, then, you made a comment that actually reminded me of something that occurred many, many years ago. Many years ago, there was grants from the province where they paid 50 to 25% for basic infrastructure. That would be water and sewer lines and those pieces. Surrey in that era, that would have probably been the mid-'80s, was very adventuresome in that, and they actually took advantage of it. And with 25 or 50 cent dollars, they put in massive amounts of infrastructure in areas that are just developing now. And they did so with, first of all, $1985, and also with dollars that were 25%. Or 50%. There was an example of some foresight where the infrastructure went in ahead of time that probably was paid for. I don't know the specifics by way of some of the borrowings that you've itemized in terms of what they could do with the massive fund as opposed to the project, or the pool as opposed to the project. It's a more recent development where I think we're seeing the economics of it becoming more challenging, and what they tend to say is that that the economics work if you have a sufficient density. If you're under-densified, then it's a challenge. But remember, the regional initiative is to try to protect the green and the agricultural land, the green space and agricultural space, so that the thought process is that communities will only be proceeding once they can densify enough to justify the services and effectively pay for them. Which means that then if you're going to be doing it, it's better to have a holistic approach, but being respectful of the economic environment you're working within, because those market forces can change dramatically and quite quickly. So you have to do it somewhat conservatively. Otherwise, you could actually find yourself overextended.
Oh, Councillor Ferguson?
I guess, I also wanted to, no, I was not on that council when that happened. It's interesting to note that going back in history, it wasn't just Surrey that picked up on a number of the connections for water using the 75% dollar or whatever it was. It was Abbotsford as well. So we're surrounded by two communities that did a number of things prior, and you can't change history, but sometimes that comes back to a challenge in the future. But anyway, those are my points. Thank you.
So we'll discuss a last option, reserve funds. So we sort of follow a policy with and a purpose for our reserve funds, which we've listed up there, which is to help stabilize taxation revenues, to fund expenditures for emergencies, fund capital programs, provide funding for infrastructure sustainability, assist with debt management, and to provide working capital. So we also have a number of a number of reserve accounts that have some guidelines on where we should be and what we're aspiring to maintain in those accounts. In the general operating fund surplus, we're projecting to have 10.3 million. Our minimum, which is based on prior year expenditures, is suggested to be 16.7 with a maximum of 25.1. The general capital is guideline is 2 million, and we have 1.8 in that one. So that's just some background information. I think we discussed that we would be coming back with more detail on reserves.
And I think, Sandra, the purpose here is to show that, yes, we still do have reserves, but we're getting to a bit of a zone where we're feeling not as comfortable as we'd like to feel with them because of the demands and pressures we have. And some of those demands and pressures are not because of expenditures, but cash flow. What I mean by that is that it's one thing to simply say, oh, you're spending too much, but we've what we've done is actually tried to actually match our expenditures with our revenues historically quite well. But the challenge we face is quite often that we are dependent upon third-party items to come forward to complete the picture. So a couple of examples then. It's one thing to actually say there's a project that's going to cost $20 million and we're going to pay for it by either borrowing or land sales. Well, land sales can take a long time and they can go through a rezoning process, and there's a big discussion as to whether or not we should be selling land or not. But even with the borrowing process, as you look at it, then when we're looking at a 9-month to a 12-month period, which we're seeing, is it means if we commit to a project and want to have it done, in 6 months, we're going to have to cash flow that until the borrowing bylaw comes forward. What we're seeing is that our cash flow is being a bit strained, and one of our biggest challenges, I guess, is and we don't have to go back to it, was the land reserve still remains outstanding, and that we haven't adequately dealt with that in terms of the long term. Effectively, the land reserve shows that we've borrowed internally about $49 million. Now, that's not all necessarily an expense. Some of that money will be repaid from borrowing or from cash flow, but it does show that that affects our overall bank account balance, and that's what's getting to be a bit of a concern. So while there is ability to play around with the edges, it's not a long-term solution for us. I think we've already used the opportunity we had in that, and now we're looking at trying to find new ways to go forward.
So this is a snapshot of our current projected reserve balances. So we have some larger balances and smaller ones in the non-stat. The land capital reserve is up there. It is at a $49 million projected deficit. And as was mentioned, there is some expectation of some monies coming back into that reserve over time. But essentially, it's borrowing money from all of the other reserves.
Councillor Woodward.
Yeah, thanks. I'm just looking at the balances from the 2021 budget. The land reserve was negative 40.3 at that time. And the balance you're showing now, could I just get an itemized, it doesn't have to be right now, just as another budget request, get a list of how it went from 40 down to 49. Thank you.
Mayor Froese.
Yeah, thank you. Just a question, do our auditors raise their eyebrows when they see the land capital deficit? And is that a concern moving forward? And which would then go to the point Ms. Ruff made, that there's an expectation of that being reduced by probably land sales, I would think.
You're correct, Your Worship. The auditors have noted on several occasions the land reserve balance, and not so much the balance, but they're looking for a proactive plan to actually retire that balance, if you will. And whether it be borrowing or land sales, they're not so much concerned about as long as there's that proactive plan. And we expect that they'll probably raise it again this year, probably a little bit more forcefully, again, not with a particular desire in mind, but in terms of a particular path or process to proceed to resolve it. So it's going to be something that we're going to have to wrestle with. And as to Councillor Woodward's comment, yes, I think we can supply that list in terms of why it grew, but the most immediate thing that came to mind was the museum in Fort Langley, where I think the overall budget is $22 million, and I think about 3/4 of that's coming from land sales, but the land sales have to go through a rezoning process, and that is not yet complete, hasn't even been to council yet. So that means that the expenditures to date are being funded at least partially through the land reserve, if it hasn't been budgeted from general revenue. And we're seeing that as a really good example of the cash flow challenges we're facing, because the land reserve effectively absorbs that till we find a path to repay it, which could be by way of either sale of land or by the way of borrowing. But the message being that we have to take into account the cash flow and have a path or a plan to ultimately conclude or bring it back to a zero or something much lower, so that we can actually show up its retirement.
So then we've brought forward a snapshot. We will obviously go into this in more detail in when we meet again on capital budgeting, but this is a snapshot of the projects, capital projects that we are carrying forward from 2021 to 2022.
And just before we leave that, sorry, just having a drink. On the carry forwards, just it's probably obvious, but bears worth repeating. These are effectively projects previously authorized by this council or previous councils. In some cases, it takes a long time for a project to work its way through the system, especially if it's a Metro Vancouver project or a provincial project like an interchange or a water treatment facility or something of that nature. So they are there as part of the carry forwards, but there may be other projects. What this provides, and we don't recommend it necessarily, but we're not adverse to it, is for council to consider the projects previously approved and determine if there's another priority that comes up. A classic example would have been the flood, for example. There may be some projects here that if we were devastated by the flood, we may have to obviously reprioritize. We're in a very good position on that, so we're not so much looking at that, but there may be some nuggets that can be mined through this process. Just keeping in mind, though, that these had been through a process. They were approved. There was a reason for their approval, and we'd want to be cautious in terms of understanding that before we reappropriated the funding.
And this is another slide of a snapshot of the proposed 2022 capital projects. We'll note on here that we have not adjusted the contribution to capital amount because we have not had that direction. But it does show an inflated amount, and also note that it includes the sewer, solid waste, and water utilities.
And always of interest here is going to be the multiplier effect in terms of when we can see the contribution to capital, what that can impact or I guess leverage from other funds such as prior year surplus, transfers from DCCs, transfers from capital works, or funding from other sources. Quite often that whole matching funds or grants, as it's called. It just does show that what can be modest can have some impacts throughout the whole system, because you want to ensure that if you're actually going to be changing the envelope, that you're doing it so in such a way as not to impact that third-party funding as to the greatest degree possible, because of course that's where we're seeing our own 25 or 50 cent dollars in terms of what our catalyst actually is.
So that brings us to the end of the bulk of the presentation, and we just wanted to put forward a timeline of our proposals. So today's the 20th, and we propose to come back in January with the capital. We will come back with capital, universal and utilities in the January timeframe.
And these dates will obviously float around depending upon council's direction a little bit. I think what Sandra's saying is at our next session, which we hope to be as early as the 10th, we can start to review the capital program. But of course, council could reverse the priorities. We could, try to adjust that as they see fit. And it gives you kind of the timeline in terms of when we can actually have, something moving forward, which is still pretty respectable, end of February, early March. But it's been a fairly robust process, keeping in mind that it began back with the Macintosh priorities that have helped us a great deal, but taken some time to actually get the inputs from, which we've talked about here today.
Mayor Frost.
Well, thank you very much for the presentation, and this is basically, I guess, a briefing for council moving on into January and some of where we actually will see some decision points. So I do appreciate this. I think a lot of good questions out of council, and a lot of good information that we have to take with us over the holidays and ruminate on it and come back in January, hopefully all fresh and raring to go. But I just want to thank you for that. And also, so Mr. Backen, is there, I guess there's nothing really required from the committee at this point. It's more of a briefing to take forward to the next.
Primarily a briefing, but there's one technical, I guess, matter, and I think that's the next slide, which is this would be something that the committee would be advising council advice to council for it to resolve. And I guess the 2 points are, one's fairly obvious. It's to confirm the universal tax increase, and the other is to use the restart grant as we outlined, and then to bring forward the balance of it. Because what's contained in here effectively, as was pointed out, is whether we call it the grant or surplus, we're using that to balance for this year. And if that's a direction we don't want to go in, it'd be helpful to have that direction now to say, well, only use half of it, or don't use it at all, or reduce, but then, or reduce your service levels or your expenditures. But again, we just cautioned that would be inconsistent with the message we took from Macintosh that we began this meeting with.
Thank you. So, I'll be happy to move this. I think it's good to move it forward. It still leaves a lot of opportunity for council to go over this. This is just a resolution from the committee to council. This certainly is in line with what council has previously directed, a 3% tax increase. And then the restart grant, the way you've described it, I know there's some questions on that, but we could still move forward with that. So I'll be happy to move this. Thank you.
Do you have a seconder? Councillor Whitmarsh seconds. We'll call the question. All in favor?
There's questions.
Oh,
there's
sorry.
questions,
All right. Miss
I like
Councillor
your
Ferguson.
style.
Let's get her done.
Get her done.
Councillor Ferguson?
I ask, before we got to this resolution, I did want to ask, and it's more of a question either in the minutes or procedurally, did we not ask council either during the Macintosh sessions or somewhere along the line? We've had a number of times where we have actually between July the 5th and the 22nd of September. Did we not ask, first of all, there's discussions around the consumer price index and the municipal price index. Did we not move that we would work towards a 2022 tax increase based on the municipal price index? Was there not a motion of some sort or a discussion of, I thought it was a motion of some sort or an understanding?
That's what we began with, where we actually showed it was the lesser of, I can certainly understand the confusion, it was the lesser of 3% or the MPI. The MPI is greater than 3%, so we're at the 3% range unless there's a change in that direction.
But I remember at the time it was 3%. The municipal price index was 3% at the time. Well, maybe you might want to flag that too. Anyway, you've got a few flags. I know you've got the restart grant. You've got a few other things. And maybe the whole thing today is a flag. I don't know. But that was some discussion, I think, that we had anyway.
Councillor Whitmarsh?
Yeah, thank you. There's three resolutions here, and I think, I'm in general fine with us moving forward with these three. The only one that I'm wondering about is the second one, which is around the restart grant. And I guess my thinking on that is that, we've had lots of good information today, but I certainly would value more discussion. And I'm wondering if this maybe wouldn't be helpful for staff, but is to amend the second one where it talks about using the restart grant or a portion of the restart grant, either all or a portion. So, I don't know. Maybe in further discussions we might decide that we only need to use 6 million of it or 5 million of it, and we could relieve some for the following year. I don't know if we have that enough clarity today that it's either all or nothing. And this, I don't know if this implies this. Maybe it doesn't. But if it was to be amended to say use all or a portion of the 7.6, maybe, I don't know if that's helpful though. Maybe that's just more confusing for staff. But I feel like there could be some flexibility in it. That's all.
I think I understand the concern is, are we committing to that at this point? And I think is it simple as the words being that up to 7.6, that we use a restart grant of up to reduce the universal tax rate for 2022?
That would be fine for me as well. I just think that, I just like a little bit more flexibility that maybe we don't have to use it all, but it's hard to decide today. So that would be something that I would prefer for that.
So just to pick up on that, I guess that's an amendment, and the amendment was moved.
I'll make an amendment to that second part of the resolution that says up to 7.608.
Second that.
Councillor Ferguson, did you have a question?
Well, I was just wanted to refer the whole thing to next full council because we don't have a full council today.
But that's what this is. This is really a referral.
Ferguson's microphone?
No, there it is. No, it isn't. Okay, while I'm on. Yeah, my thing, I know I can't, I'm speaking to I'm not speaking to the, mine was to resolve refer the whole thing to a full council, so, because we've talked about not a full council being here, so we could discuss all three things. That was mine.
Yeah, Mayor Froese?
Yeah, the motion, this is a committee, so this motion really, the committee has no standing. It's the council that needs to deal with it. So this motion does send it to the council. That's what the motion does. Only referral will be to another council process committee, but I think that would be appropriate, but this is really going to council as it is, so it is in fact a referral to council. It's
Okay, so
on the amendment.
I'll call the question on the amendment. All in favor? Opposed? Is there anyone opposed? I can't see. Oh, Councillor Woodward is opposed?
No.
Oh, sorry.
Question. Music question.
Do you want to, yeah, you got a question? Councillor Woodward, go ahead.
I want to clarify, I was not opposed to that amendment.
Okay,
so-
sorry.
Um, So I just want to clarify, I understood this to be actually a regular meeting of council for the purposes of budget discussions, but Mayor Froese has raised twice that we're existing within the CPC structure, so could I get that clarified?
No, that's correct. When we actually canvassed council about our meeting earlier in December, there was some conflicts. So the process we understood it was that it would be simply added to the CPC agenda. So we're in the third section of today's CPC agenda, where we're compelled to only make recommendations to council, not actually pass them as special independent resolutions.
Okay, so I just want to clarify that, because previous budget discussion meetings have been regular meetings of council, so we would not, but if we're referring this back anyway, then I would agree a referral seems redundant. I would also prefer, however, not to be heading down this direction without two members of council present, so I don't support it. I prefer that the budget process would be more collaborative than just, well, we have 5 votes, so just approve it, which just happens a lot. So I would prefer that we not really be looking at this until, not endorsing it in any way, so I won't be supporting it. I also find it a bit restrictive. I've had the budget for, I still don't have it. So actually, I think I have some slides. So for me to say I'm okay with 3% or would not consider more based upon some other good projects, I'm not prepared to do that. I'm not really prepared to say we're going to use up that 7.6, not having the budget. And I'm not prepared to talk about the third one, not having the budget. Thank you.
Councillor Ferguson?
Procedurally, we've only voted for an amendment. We haven't voted for the whole thing yet. So now, if I can, I think I just said it before, I'd prefer the whole council rather than, even if it's a CPC, I'd just prefer the whole item, all three of that council, that confirms, resolve, and resolve, all three be referred to the next either session of budget or I guess of meeting of council, whatever comes first. I also move that. Did you pick up on what I meant by that? Okay, I'll also move that. I don't know how much support I'll get, but I'll move it anyway.
Do we have a seconder? No seconder? Okay. Now what happens? Right. Okay, so Councillor Whitmarsh.
Yeah, I certainly appreciate the importance of having all the members of council. But I don't think that this is making a decision without the members of council. This is sending it to council so that all members of council can have input and can have discussions. This is just allowing staff to continue to do their work, and when we meet in January, we'll have the full council. I'm concerned that if we don't, then we'll have to send this to another CPC, and we'll be discussing this in January or whatever that date is for CPC, then going to a council for further discussion, which will even further delay the process. I think we've already had discussions here about the budgeting process, and already we're looking at timing of into April or into May. So I would prefer that we send this to council. Let's send it. Let's have all of council discuss it. That makes sense to me. I agree with everyone's statements today, and the best way to do that is to send it today to all of council. So I will support it.
Councillor Woodward.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think that, I don't think that, I'm not raising any objections regarding the fact that 2 members aren't here. I don't understand. I think, Mr. Backen, you mentioned it's important to get some direction to staff. So this sounds to me like a pretty solid endorsement if everyone here is going to support this, to head down this path. I think that's what it feels like to me, that by January 10th, that would be another block of work done, essentially heading down the direction that these 3 resolutions are heading. I don't see this as a typical CPC referral back to council. Is that fair?
The technically the council still has to make a decision whether we want to continue down this path because these are recommendations. As to your first point, the staff are looking to see if we're on the right path given the principles we've extrapolated from the Macintosh sessions in terms of the strategic direction. It is quite fair to say that these direction could change, but when we try to put all the pieces together, we are trying to figure out what the philosophy or direction is with a view to having the more inclusive, process, because ultimately on these other topics then, if we know we're in balance, then the question is how do we wish to actually spend the money? Now, that would be very inclusive because there would be advice provided to council in terms of what the priorities were, but we've heard loud and clear that they want to have council wishes to have more latitude in establishing those priorities. This approach is a bit different in that we're trying to go from the principles from as I call proactive to the throughout the process. So we're trying to be proactive and say, okay, well, with this direction, then we can start to craft a budget. The 7.6 could certainly still be reduced by way of, borrowing or use of surpluses. But at this point, we're a bit constrained in trying to figure out how else to balance the budget. The concern, I think, staff is we continue to see the need to meet the community's needs for service level enhancements, but without the revenue associated with it, and that certainly does require some creativity, and we're trying to provide that creativity, or at least the opportunity for council to be creative in terms of that process.
Yeah, and I certainly appreciate the nuances in how the approach has evolved. In terms of the timing, though, I think, I've raised this, as politely as I think I could, that I wanted this process to be happening sooner so that we weren't in this situation. Now it's January 10th and we've got 2 weeks for public input, if feasible, I think I saw on there. Not a lot of time really to kick it around as a council. And so it's not me doing that. I've been trying to ask for it to come forward sooner since I got elected. So, but I also don't understand this idea that somehow we're going to be voting for motions to just send them to the council table. I read it, that council confirms the 2022, doesn't say maybe, doesn't say could be changed, said will be 3%. I don't feel I have it. I've had a 2-hour presentation with some slides. I don't possibly know how I would make that decision one way or the other. That council resolved to direct staff to use the restart grant of $7.6 million to reduce the universal tax rate. I don't know if I support that particularly, creating the structural problem that I mentioned earlier in the terms of millions of dollars being kicked to the next council. I don't support doing that to the next council. So I don't support these motions. So why would I vote for them? And it's that simple for me. I would prefer that other people were here, of course, as well. But if they're not, as Mayor Froese has said at the last meeting, business continues. The problem I have is I don't support these motions based on a 2-hour presentation. And I think that there's a pretty deep flaw in the process that we're expected to do that. Thanks.
Councillor Ferguson.
Oh, yeah, for different reasons, myself, I've asked for some parts of these presentation to be flagged, so I've actually requested that, that. There'll perhaps be other, I actually said perhaps the whole thing should be flagged, and maybe that was an indication. Number one, the council confirmed, what are we confirming, and what is, I have to do my own research of what we did approve, what we did suggest as far as a municipal price index compared to the consumer price index. That there was a discussion about that. I have to do my own research on that. I want to thank staff. I think they've done the best they can. They've always answered my question. They've always made themselves presentable at all times. Both current staff and past staff, directors and otherwise, they've always had their office available, especially when I put binders this big and started going through the capital and operational line by line sometimes, but I've always appreciated that. And so the restart grant, I need more information, I've said that, and the resolve to direct staff, well, they're going to be directed anyway, so so that's why I have a challenge moving this resolution. I might not have a challenge a month from now, but right now, today, knowing that we don't have a full council, I have a challenge with that. Thank you.
Mayor Froese.
I just want to say this meeting was published well in advance, and there are things that come up to council, and we do have a quorum. So I know it's good to have everybody here, but this isn't the full council. This is a CPC meeting. I just want to reiterate that. This is going to council, and it doesn't mean that these are passed by council in this forum, but it certainly gives staff some direction based on what we've heard today and based on some of the ideas, and gives us something to think about. So I don't see this as being threatening at all to anybody. I think this is just we as committee have had a discussion as in committee, and now it's going to council for further discussion, and that's all it is. I don't see where the concerns are that this is making decisions, because we're just sending this off to council. We're a committee, not the full council, not a council. Thanks.
Councillor Woodward?
Yeah, thanks. I never heard anybody use the word threatening, so I'm not threatened by the process. I mean, I didn't hear anybody say that, so I don't know where that's coming from. I for me, just don't see how we vote for motions that we think, oh, we'll just change them later, or it's just going off to the council table. I don't know why we would support a motion that we don't support. So it's to me wildly premature to be suggesting that maybe the tax increase won't be 3.4 or 3.7. Based upon inflationary measures that I read about in the news every day currently. So I don't know why we would be setting these even as the benchmarks to go to council. And again, the structural problem that's embedded in number 2 of a pretty significant nature. So again, I don't know why we would support motions that, may change later, or we don't have any information. I don't even know what the basis would be to vote for it or against it based upon a 2-hour presentation. So I prefer the process to be different, but it's not. So I don't support it. Thanks.
Okay, I would like to call the question on the resolution. All in favor? Opposed? Councillor Woodward and Councillor Ferguson opposed? That passes. Is there anything else? Other business? Thank you very much for the presentation. Is there any other business? No? Okay, motion to terminate. Yeah, you're welcome.